Chapter 1 of How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 1. First, be a man. The great need at this hour is manly men. We want no goody-goody piety, we have too much of it. We want men who will do right, though the heavens fall, who believe in God, and who will confess Him. Rev. W.J. Dawson. All the world cries, "Where is the man who will save us? We want a man." Don't look so far for this man, you have him at hand. This man, it is you, it is I, it is each one of us. How to constitute oneself a man? Nothing harder if one knows not how to will it, nothing easier if one wills it. Alexander Dumas. "I thank God I am a Baptist," said a little short doctor of divinity, as he mounted a step at a convention. "Louder, louder!" shouted a man in the audience. "We can't hear." "Get up higher," said another. "I can't," replied the doctor. "To be a Baptist is as high as one can get." But there is something higher than being a Baptist, and that is being a man. Rousseau says, "According to the order of nature, men being equal, their common vocation is the profession of humanity, and whoever is well educated to discharge the duty of a man cannot be badly prepared to fill any of those offices that have a relation to him. It matters little to me whether my pupil be designed for the army, the pulpit, or the bar. To live is the profession I would teach him. When I have done with him, it is true he will be neither a soldier, a lawyer, nor a divine. Let him first be a man. Fortune may remove him from one rank to another, as she pleases, he will always be found in his place." "First of all," replied the boy James A. Garfield, when asked what he meant to be, "I must make myself a man. If I do not succeed in that, I can succeed in nothing." "Hear me, O men!" cried Diogenes in the marketplace at Athens. And when a crowd collected around him, he said scornfully, "I called for men, not pygmies." One great need of the world today is for men and women who are good animals. To endure the strain of our concentrated civilization, the coming man and woman must have an excess of animal spirits. They must have a robustness of health. Mere absence of disease is not health. It is the overflowing fountain, not the one half full, that gives life and beauty to the valley below. Only he is healthy who exults in mere animal existence, whose very life is a luxury, who feels a bounding pulse throughout his body, who feels life in every limb, as dogs do when scouring over the field, or as boys do when gliding over fields of ice. Dispense with the doctor by being temperate, the lawyer by keeping out of debt, the demagogue by voting for honest men, and poverty by being industrious. "Nephew," said Sir Godfrey Kneller, the artist, to a Guinea slave trader, who entered the room where his uncle was talking with Alexander Pope, "you have the honor of seeing the two greatest men in the world." "I don't know how great men you may be," said the Guinea man, as he looked contemptuously upon their diminutive physical proportions, "but I don't like your looks. I have often bought a much better man than either of you, all muscles and bones, for 10 guineas. A man is never so happy as when he suffices to himself, and can walk without crutches or a guide. Said Jean Paul Richter, "I have made as much out of myself as could be made of the stuff, and no man should require more." "The body of an athlete and the soul of a sage," wrote Voltaire to Helvetius. "These are what we require to be happy." Although millions are out of employment in the United States, how difficult it is to find a thorough, reliable, self-dependent, industrious man or woman, young or old, for any position, whether as a domestic servant, an office boy, a teacher, a brakeman, a conductor, an engineer, a clerk, a bookkeeper, or whatever we may want. It is almost impossible to find a really competent person in any department, and oftentimes we have to make many trials before we can get a position fairly well filled. It is a superficial age. Very few prepare for their work. Of thousands of young women trying to get a living at typewriting, many are so ignorant, so deficient in the common rudiments even, that they spell badly, use bad grammar, and know scarcely anything of punctuation. In fact, they murder the English language. They can copy, parrot-like, and that is about all. The same superficiality is found in nearly all kinds of business. It is next to impossible to get a first-class mechanic. He has not learned his trade, he has picked it up, and botches everything he touches, spoiling good material and wasting valuable time. In the professions, it is true, we find greater skill and faithfulness, but usually they have been developed at the expense of mental and moral breadth. The merely professional man is narrow. Worse than that, he is in a sense an artificial man, a creature of technicalities and specialties, removed alike from the broad truth of nature and from the healthy influence of human converse. In society, the most accomplished man of mere professional skill is often a nullity. He has sunk his personality in his dexterity. "The aim of every man," said Humboldt, "should be to secure the highest and most harmonious development of his powers to a complete and consistent whole." Some men impress us as immense possibilities. They seem to have a sweep of intellect that is grand, a penetrative power that is phenomenal. They seem to know everything, to have read everything, to have seen everything. Nothing seems to escape the keenness of their vision, but somehow they are forever disappointing our expectations. They raise great hopes only to dash them. They are men of great promise, but they never pay. There is some indefinable want in their make-up. What the world needs is a clergyman who is broader than his pulpit, who does not look upon humanity with a white neckcloth ideal, and who would give the lie to the saying that the human race is divided into three classes: men, women, and ministers. Wanted, a clergyman who does not look upon his congregation from the standpoint of old theological books and dusty cobweb creeds, but who sees the merchant as in his store, the clerk as making sales, the lawyer pleading before the jury, the physician standing over the sick bed. In other words, who looks upon the great, throbbing, stirring, pulsing, competing, scheming, ambitious, impulsive, tempted mass of humanity as one of their number, who can live with them, see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and experience their sensations. The world has a standing advertisement over the door of every profession, every occupation, every calling: "Wanted, a man." Wanted, a lawyer who has not become the victim of his specialty, a mere walking bundle of precedents. Wanted, a shopkeeper who does not discuss markets wherever he goes. A man should be so much larger than his calling, so broad and symmetrical in his culture, that he would not talk shop in society, that no one would suspect how he gets his living. Nothing is more apparent in this age of specialties than the dwarfing, crippling, mutilating influence of occupations or professions. Specialties facilitate commerce and promote efficiency in the professions, but are often narrowing to individuals. The spirit of the age tends to doom the lawyer to a narrow life of practice, the business man to a mere money-making career. Think of a man, the grandest of God's creations, spending his lifetime standing beside a machine for making screws. There is nothing to call out his individuality, his ingenuity, his powers of balancing, judging, deciding. He stands there year after year until he seems but a piece of mechanism. His powers, from lack of use, dwindle to mediocrity, to inferiority, until finally he becomes a mere part of the machine he tends. Wanted, a man who will not lose his individuality in a crowd, a man who has the courage of his convictions, who is not afraid to say "No," though all the world say "Yes." Wanted, a man who, though he is dominated by a mighty purpose, will not permit one great faculty to dwarf, cripple, warp, or mutilate his manhood, who will not allow the overdevelopment of one faculty to stunt or paralyze his other faculties. Wanted, a man who is larger than his calling, who considers it a low estimate of his occupation to value it merely as a means of getting a living. Wanted, a man who sees self-development, education and culture, discipline and drill, character and manhood in his occupation. As Nature tries every way to induce us to obey her laws by rewarding their observance with health, pleasure and happiness, and punishes their violation by pain and disease, so she resorts to every means to induce us to expand and develop the great possibilities she has implanted within us. She nerves us to the struggle beneath which all great blessings are buried, and beguiles the tedious marches by holding up before us glittering prizes which we may almost touch, but never quite possess. She covers up her ends of discipline by trial, of character building through suffering, by throwing a splendor and glamour over the future, lest the hard dry facts of the present dishearten us and she fail in her great purpose. How else could Nature call the youth away from all the charms that hang around young life, but by presenting to his imagination pictures of future bliss and greatness, which will haunt his dreams until he resolves to make them real? As a mother teaches her babe to walk, by holding up a toy at a distance, not that the child may reach the toy, but that it may develop its muscles and strength, compared with which the toys are mere baubles. So Nature goes before us through life, tempting us with higher and higher toys, but ever with one object in view, the development of the man. In every great painting of the masters there is one idea or figure which stands out boldly beyond everything else. Every other idea or figure on the canvas is subordinate to this idea or figure, and finds its real significance not in itself, but, pointing to the central idea, finds its true expression there. So in the vast universe of God every object of creation is but a guide board with an index finger pointing to the central figure of the created universe, man. Nature writes this thought upon every leaf. She thunders it in every creation. It exhales from every flower. It twinkles in every star. Open thy bosom, set thy wishes wide, and let in manhood, let in happiness. Admit the boundless theater of thought from nothing up to God, which makes a man. Young. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Pamela Krantz.
Chapter 2 of How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tech Savvy. How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 2. Seize your opportunity. The blowing winds are but our servants when we hoist the sail. You must come to know that each admirable genius is but a successful diver in that sea whose floor of pearls is all your own. By Emerson. Who waits until the wind shall silent keep, who never finds the ready hour to sow, who watcheth clouds will have no time to reap. By Helen Hunt Jackson. The secret of success in life is for a man to be ready for his opportunity when it comes. By Disraeli. Do the best you can where you are, and, when that is accomplished, God will open a door for you and a voice will call, "Come up hither into a higher sphere." By Beecher. Our grand business is, not to see what lies dimly at a distance, but to do what lies clearly at hand. By Carroll. "When I was a boy," said General Grant, "my mother one morning found herself without butter for breakfast, and sent me to borrow some from a neighbor. Going into the house without knocking, I overheard a letter read from the son of a neighbor, who was then at West Point, stating that he had failed in examination and was coming back home. I got the butter, took it home, and without waiting for breakfast ran to the office of the congressman for our district. 'Mr. Hammer,' I said, 'will you appoint me to West Point?' 'No. Is there, and has 3 years to serve. But suppose he should fail, will you send me?' Mr. Hammer laughed. 'If he don't go through, no use for you to try, you lie. Promise me you will give me the chance, Mr. Hammer, anyhow.' Mr. Hammer promised. The next day the defeated lad came home, and the congressman, laughing at my sharpness, gave me the appointment. 'Now,' said Grant, 'it was my mother's being without butter that made me general and president.' But he was mistaken. It was his own shrewdness to see the chance, and the promptness to seize it, that urged him upward. 'There is nobody,' says a Roman cardinal, 'whose fortune does not visit once in his life, but when she finds he is not ready to receive her, she goes in at the door and out through the window.' Opportunity is coy. The careless, the slow, and the observant, the lazy fail to see it, or clutch at it when it has gone. The sharp fellows detect it instantly, and catch it when on the wing. The utmost which can be said about the matter is, that circumstances will and do combine to help men at some periods of their lives, and combine to thwart them at others. Thus much we freely admit, but there is no fatality in these combinations, neither any such thing as luck or chance, as commonly understood. They come and go like all other opportunities and occasions in life, and if they are seized upon and made the most of, the man whom they benefit is fortunate; but if they are neglected and allowed to pass by unimproved, he is unfortunate. 'Charley,' says Moses H. Grinnell to a clerk born in New York City, 'take my overcoat tip to my house on the Fifth Avenue.' Mr. Charley takes the coat, mutters something about 'I'm not an errand boy. I came here to learn business,' and moves reluctantly. Mr. Grinnell sees it, and at the same time one of his New England clerks says, 'I'll take it up.' 'That is right. Do so,' says Mr. G., and to himself he says, 'That boy is smart. He will work,' and he gives him plenty to do. He gets promoted, gets the confidence of business men, as well as of his employers, and is soon known as a successful man. The youth who starts out in life determined to make the most of his eyes and let nothing escape him which he can possibly use for his own advancement, who keeps his ears open for every sound that can help him on his way, who keeps his hands open he may clutch every opportunity, who is ever on the alert for everything which can help him to get on in the world, who seizes every experience in life and grinds it up into paint for his great life's picture, who keeps his heart open that he may catch every noble impulse and everything which may inspire him, will be sure to live a successful life. There are no ifs or ands about it. If he has his health, nothing can keep him from success. Zion's Herald says that Isaac Rich, who gave 1,350,000 to found Boston University of the Methodist Episcopal Church, began business thus: at 18 he went from Cape Cod to Boston with $3 or $4 in his possession, and looked about for something to do, rising early, walking far, observing closely, reflecting much. Soon he had an idea. He bought 3 bushels of oysters, hired a wheelbarrow, found a piece of board, bought 6 small plates, 6 iron forks, a 3-cent pepper box, and one or two other things. He was at the oyster boat buying his oysters at 3 o'clock in the morning, wheeled them in 3 miles, set up his board near a market, and began business. He sold out his oysters as fast as he could get them, at a good profit. In that same market he continued to deal in oysters and fish for 40 years, became king of the business, and ended by founding a college. His success was won by the industry and honesty. "Give me a chance," said Halliburton's stupid, "and I will show you." But most likely he has had his chance already and neglected it. "Well, boys," said Mr. A New York merchant, to his 4 clerks, one winter morning in 1815, "this is good news. Peace has been declared. Now we must be up and doing. We shall have our hands full, but we can do as much as anybody." He was owner and part owner of several ships lying dismantled during the war, 3 miles up the river, which was covered with ice and an inch thick. He knew that it would be a month before the ice yielded for the season, and that thus the merchants in other towns where the harbors were open would have time to be in the foreign markets before him. His decision therefore was instantly taken. "Reuben," he continued, addressing one of his clerks, "go and collect as many laborers as possible to go up in the river. Charles, do you find Mr. the rigger, and Mr. the sailmaker, and tell them I want them immediately. John, engage half a dozen truckmen for today and tomorrow. Stephen, do you hunt up as many gravers and caulkers as you can, and hire them to work for me." And Mr. A himself sallied forth to provide the necessary implements for ice breaking. Before 12 o'clock that day upward of 100 men were 3 miles up the river, clearing the ships and cutting away ice, which they sawed out in large squares, and then thrust under the mainmast to open up the channel. The roofing over the ships was torn off, and the clatter of the caulkers' mallets was like to the rattling of a hailstorm. Loads of rigging were passed up on the ice. Riggers went to and fro with belt and knife. Sailmakers busily plied their needles, and the whole presented an unusual scene of stir and activity and well-directed labor. Before night the ships were afloat, and moved some distance down the channel, and by the time they had reached the wharf, namely in some 8 or 10 days, their rigging and spars were aloft, their upper timbers caulked, and everything ready for them to go to sea. Thus Mr. A competed and on equal terms with the merchants of open seaports. Large and quick gains rewarded his enterprise, and his neighbors spoke deprecatingly of his good luck. But as the writer from whom we get the story says, Mr. A was equal to his opportunity, and this was the secret of his good fortune. A Baltimore lady lost a valuable diamond bracelet at a ball, and supposed it was stolen from the pocket of her cloak. Years afterward she walked the streets near the Peabody Institute to get money to purchase food. She cut up an old, worn-out, ragged cloak to make a hood of, when lo! in the lining of the cloak she discovered the diamond bracelet. During all her poverty she was worth $3,500, but did not know it. Many of us who think we are poor are rich in opportunities if we could only see them, in possibilities all about us, in faculties worth more than diamond bracelets, in power to do good. In our large Eastern cities it has been found that at least 94 out of every 100 found their first fortune at home or near at hand. and in meeting common everyday wants. It is a sorry day for a young man who cannot see any opportunities where he is, but thinks he can do better somewhere else. Several Brazilian shepherds organized a party to go to California to dig gold, and took along a handful of clear pebbles to play checkers with on the voyage. They discovered after arriving at Sacramento, after they had thrown most of the pebbles away, that they were all diamonds. They returned to Brazil only to find that the mines had been taken up by the others and sold to the government. The richest gold and silver mine in Nevada was sold for $42 by the owner, to get money to pay his passage to other mines where he thought he could get rich. Professor Agassiz told the Harvard students of a farmer who owned a farm of hundreds of acres of unprofitable woods and rocks, and concluded to sell out and try some more remunerative business. He studied coal measures and coal oil deposits and experimented for a long time. He sold his farm for $200 and went into the oil business 200 miles away. Only a short time afterward the man who bought the farm discovered a great flood of coal oil, which the farmer had ignorantly tried to drain off. A man was once sitting in an uncomfortable chair in Boston, talking with a friend as to what he could do to help mankind. "I should think it would be a good thing," said the friend, "to begin by getting up an easier and cheaper chair." "I will do it!" he exclaimed, leaping up and examining the chair. He found a great deal of rattan thrown away by the East India merchant ships, whose cargoes were wrapped in it. He began the manufacture of rattan chairs and other furniture, and has astonished the world by what he has done with what was before thrown away. While this man was dreaming about some far off success, he at that very time had fortune awaiting only his ingenuity and industry. If you want to get rich, study yourself and your own wants. You will find millions of dollars have the same wants, the same demands. The safest business is always connected with men's prime necessities. They must have clothing, dwellings, they must eat. They want comforts, facilities of all kinds, for use and pleasure, luxury, education, culture. Any man who can supply a great want of humanity, improve any methods which men use, supply any demand, or contribute in any way to their well-being, can make a fortune. But it is detrimental to the highest success to undertake anything merely because it is profitable. If the vocation does not supply a human want, if it is not helpful, if it is degrading, if it is narrowing, don't touch it. A selfish vocation never pays. If it belittles the manhood, blights the affections, dwarfs the mental life, chills the charities, and shrivels the soul, don't touch it. Choose that occupation, if possible, which will be the most helpful to the largest number. It is estimated that 5 out of every 7 of the millionaire manufacturers began by making, with their own hands, the articles on which they made their fortune. One of the greatest hindrances to the advancement and promotion in life is the lack of observation and the disinclination to take pains. A keen, cultivated observation will see a fortune where others see only poverty. An observing man, the eyelets of whose shoes pulled out, but who could ill afford to get another pair, said to himself, "I will make a metallic lacing hook, which can be riveted into leather." He succeeded in doing so, and now he is a very rich man. An observing barber in Newark, N.J., thought he could make an improvement on shears for cutting hair, and invented clippers, and became very rich. A Maine man was called from the hayfield to wash out the clothes for his invalid wife. He had never realized that it was to wash before. He invented the washing machine and made a fortune. A man who was suffering terribly with toothache said to himself there must be some way of filling teeth to prevent them from aching. He invented gold filling for teeth. The great things of the world have not been done by men of large means. Want has been the great schoolmaster of the race. Necessity has been the mother of all great inventions. Ericsson began the construction of his screw propeller in a bathroom. John Harrison, the great inventor of the marine chronometer, began his career in the loft of an old barn. Parts of the first steamboat ever run in America were set up in the vestry of an old church in Philadelphia by Fitch. McCormick began to make his famous reaper in an old grist mill. The first model dry dock was made in an attic. Clark, the founder of Clark University of Worcester, Massachusetts, began his great fortune by making toy wagons in a horse shed. Opportunities! They crowd around us. Forces of nature plead to be used in the service of man, as lightning for ages tried to attract his attention to electricity, which would do his drudgery and leave him to develop the God-given powers within him. There is power lying latent everywhere, waiting for the observant eye to discover it. First, find out what the people need and then supply that want. An invention to make the smoke go the wrong way in a chimney might be a very ingenious thing, but it would be of no use to humanity. The Patent Office at Washington is full of wonderful devices, ingenious mechanism. Not one in hundreds is of earthly use to the inventor or to the world. And yet how many families have been impoverished and have struggled for years mid want and woe, while the father has been working on useless inventions. These men did not study the wants of humanity. A.T. Stewart, as a boy, lost 87 cents when his capital was $1.50 in buying buttons and thread which people would not purchase. After that he made it a rule never to buy anything which people did not want. The first thing a youth entering the city to make his home there needs to do is make himself a necessity to the person who employs him. According to the Boston Herald, whatever he may have been at home, it counts for nothing until he has done something that makes known the quality of the stuff that is in him. If he shirks work, however humble it may be, the work will soon be inclined to shirk him. But the youth who comes into a city to make his way in the world, and is not afraid of doing his best whether he is paid for it or not, is not long in finding remunerative employment. The people who seem so indifferent to employing young people from the country are eagerly watching for the newcomers, but they look for qualities of character and service in actual work before they manifest confidence or give recognition. It is the youth who is deserving that wins his way out to the front, and when once he has been tested his promotion is only a question of time. It is the same with young women. There are seemingly no places for them where they can earn a decent living, but the moment they fill their places worthily there is enough room for them, and progress is rapid. What the city people desire most is to find those who have the ability to take important places, and the question of gaining a position in the city resolves itself at once into the question of what the young persons have brought with them from home. It is the staying qualities that have been inwrought from childhood which are now in requisition, and the success of the boy or girl is determined by the amount of energetic character that has been developed in the early years at home. Take up the experience of every man and woman who has made a mark in the city for the last 100 years, and it has been the sterling qualities of the home training that have constituted the success of later years. Don't think you have no chance in life because you have no capital to begin with. Most of the rich men of today began poor. The chances are you would be ruined if you had capital. You can only use to advantage what has become a part of yourself by your earning it. It is estimated that not one rich man's son in 10,000 dies rich. God has given every man a capital to start with. We are born rich. He is rich who has good health, a sound body, good muscles. He is rich who has a good head, a good disposition, a good heart. He is rich who has two good hands, with five chances on each. Equipped? Every man is equipped as only God could equip him. What a fortune he possesses in the marvelous mechanism of his body and mind! It is individual effort that has accomplished everything worth accomplishing in this world. Money to start with is only a crutch, which, if any misfortune knocks it from under you, would only make your fall all the more certain. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 3. How did he begin? There can be no doubt that the captains of industry today, using that term in its broadest sense, are men who began life as poor boys. Seth Low. Poverty is very terrible, and sometimes kills the very soul within us. But it is the north wind that lashes men into Vikings. It is the soft, luscious south wind which lulls them to lotus dreams. Ouida. 'Tis a common proof that lowliness is young ambition's ladder. Shakespeare. 50 years ago, said Hezekiah Conant, the millionaire manufacturer and philanthropist of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, I persuaded my father to let me leave my home in Dudley, Massachusetts, and strike out for myself. So, one morning in May 1845, the old farm horse and wagon was hitched up, and, dressed in our Sunday clothes, father and I started for Worcester. Our object was to get me the situation offered by an advertisement in the Worcester County Gazette, as follows: Boy wanted. Wanted immediately. At the Gazette office, a well-disposed boy, able to do heavy rolling. Worcester, May 7. The financial inducements were $30 the first year, $35 the next, and $40 the third year, and board in the employer's family. These conditions were accepted, and I began work the next day. The Gazette was an ordinary 4-page sheet. I soon learned what "heavy rolling" meant, for the paper was printed on a Washington hand press, the edition of about 2,000 copies, requiring 2 laborious intervals of about 10 hours each every week. The printing of the outside was generally done Friday, and kept me very busy all day. The inside went to press about 3 or 4 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, and it was after 3 o'clock on Wednesday morning before I could go to bed, tired and lame from the heavy rolling. In addition, I also had the laborious task of carrying a quantity of water from the pump behind the block around to the entrance in front, and then up 2 flights of stairs, usually a daily job. I was at first everybody's servant. I was abused, called all sorts of nicknames, had to sweep out the office, build fires in winter, run errands, post bills, carry papers, wait on the editor. In fact, I led the life of a genuine printer's devil. But when I showed them at length that I had learned to set type and run the press, I got promoted, and another boy was hired to succeed in my task with all its decorations. That was my first success, and from that day to this I have never asked anybody to get me a job or situation, and never used a letter of recommendation. But when an important job was in prospect, the proposed employers were given all facilities to learn of my abilities and character. If some young men are easily discouraged, I hope they may gain encouragement and strength from my story. It is a long, rough road at first, but, like the ship on the ocean, You must lay your course for the place where you hope to land, and take advantage of all favoring circumstances. Don't go about the town any longer in that outlandish rig. Let me give you an order on the store. Dress up a little, Horace. Horace Greeley looked down on his clothes, as if he had never before noticed how seedy they were, and replied, "You see, Mr. Sterrett, my father is on a new place, and I want to help him all I can." He had spent but $6 for personal expenses in 7 months, and was to receive 135 from Judge J. M. Sterrett of the Erie Gazette for substitute work. He retained but $15, and gave the rest to his father, with whom he had moved from Vermont to western Pennsylvania, and for whom he had camped out many a night to guard the sheep from wolves. He was nearly 21, and although tall and gawky, with tow-colored hair, a pale face and whining voice, he resolved to seek his fortune in New York City. Slinging his bundle of clothes on a stick over his shoulder, he walked 60 miles through the woods to Buffalo, rode on a canal boat to Albany, descended the Hudson in a barge, and reached New York just as the sun was rising, August 18, 1831. For days Horace wandered up and down the streets, going into scores of buildings and asking if they wanted a hand. But no was the invariable reply. His quaint appearance led many to think he was an escaped apprentice. One Sunday at his boarding place, he heard that printers were wanted at West's printing office. He was at the door at 5 o'clock Monday morning, and asked the foreman for a job at 7. The latter had no idea that the country greenhorn could set type for the Polyglot Testament on which help was needed, but said, "Fix up a case for him, and we'll see if he can do anything." When the proprietor came in, he objected to the newcomer, and told the foreman to let him go when his first day's work was done. That night Horace showed a proof of the largest and most correct day's work that had then been done. In 10 years Horace was a partner in a small printing office. He founded the New Yorker, the best weekly paper in the United States, but it was not profitable. When Harrison was nominated for president in 1840, Greeley started the Log Cabin, which reached the then fabulous circulation of 90,000. But on this paper, at a penny a copy, he made no money. His next venture was the New York Tribune, price 1 cent. To start it, he borrowed $1,000, and printed 5,000 copies of the first number. It was difficult to give them all away. He began with 600 subscribers, and increased the list to 11,000 in 6 weeks. The demand for the Tribune grew faster than new machinery could be obtained to print it. It was a paper whose editor always tried to be right. At the World's Fair in New York in 1853, President Pierce might have been seen watching a young man exhibiting a patent rat trap. He was attracted by the enthusiasm and diligence of the young man, but never dreamed that he would become one of the richest men in the world. It seemed like small business for Jay Gould to be exhibiting a rat trap, but he did it well and with enthusiasm. In fact, he was bound to do it as well as it could be done. Young Gould supported himself by odd jobs at surveying, paying his way by erecting sundials for farmers at $1 apiece, frequently taking his pay in board. Thus he laid the foundation for the business career in which he became so rich. Frederick Douglass started in life with less than nothing, for he did not own his own body, and he was pledged before his birth to pay his master's debts. To reach the starting point of the poorest white boy, he had to climb as far as the distance which the latter must ascend if he would become President of the United States. He saw his mother but 2 or 3 times, and then in the night, when she would walk 12 miles to be with him an hour, returning in time to go into the field at dawn. He had no chance to study, for he had no teacher, and the rules of the plantation forbade slaves to learn to read and write. But somehow, unnoticed by his master, he managed to learn the alphabet from scraps of paper and patent medicine almanacs, and no limits could then be placed to his career. He put to shame thousands of white boys. He fled from slavery at 21, went north and worked as a stevedore in New York and New Bedford. At Nantucket he was given an opportunity to speak in an anti-slavery meeting, and made so favorable an impression that he was made agent of the Anti-Slavery Society of Massachusetts. While traveling from place to lecture, he would study with all his might. He was sent to Europe to lecture, and won the friendship of several Englishmen, who gave him $750, with which he purchased his freedom. He edited a paper in Rochester, New York, and afterward conducted the New Era in Washington. For several years he was Marshal of the District of Columbia. He became the first colored man in the United States, the peer of any man in the country, and died honored by all in 1895. What has been done can be done again, said the boy with no chance, who became Lord Beaconsfield, England's great Prime Minister. I am not a slave, I am not a captive, and by energy I can overcome greater obstacles. Jewish blood flowed in his veins, and everything seemed against him. But he remembered the example of Joseph, who became Prime Minister of Egypt 4,000 years before, and that of Daniel, who was Prime Minister to the greatest despot of the world 5 centuries before the birth of Christ. He pushed his way up through the lower classes, up through the middle classes, up through the upper classes, until he stood a master, self-poised upon the topmost round of political and social power. Rebuffed, scorned, ridiculed, hissed down in the House of Commons, he simply said, "The time will come when you shall hear me." The time did come, and the boy with no chance but a determined will swayed the scepter of England for a quarter of a century. I learned grammar when I was a private soldier on the pay of 6d. a day, said William Cobbett. The edge of my berth, or that of the guard bed, was my seat to study in. My knapsack was my bookcase. A bit of board lying on my lap was my writing table. And the task did not demand anything like a year of my life. I had no money to purchase candles or oil. In winter it was rarely that I could get any evening light but that of the fire, and only my turn even of that. To buy a pen or a sheet of paper, I was compelled to forego some portion of my food, though in a state of half starvation. I had no moment of time that I could call my own, and I had to read and write amidst the talking, laughing, singing, whistling, and bawling of at least a half a score of the most thoughtless of men, and that, too, in the hours of their freedom from all control. Think not lightly of the farthing I had to give, now and then, for pen, ink, or paper. That farthing was, alas, a great sum to me. I was as tall as I am now, and I had great health and great exercise. The whole of the money not expended for us at market was 2d. a week for each man. I remember, and well I may, that upon one occasion I had, after all absolutely necessary expenses, on a Friday, made shift to have a halfpenny in reserve, which I had destined for the purchase of a red herring in the morning. But when I pulled off my clothes at night, so hungry then as to be hardly able to endure life, I found that I had lost my halfpenny. I buried my head under the miserable sheet and rug, and cried like a child. If I, under such circumstances, could encounter and overcome this task, he added, can there be in the world a youth to find any excuse for its non-performance? "I have talked with great men," Lincoln told his fellow clerk and friend, Greene, according to McClure's Magazine, "and I do not see how they differ from others." He made up his mind to put himself before the public, and talked of his plans to his friends. In order to keep in practice in speaking, he walked 7 or 8 miles to debating clubs. Practicing polemics was what he called the exercise. He seems now for the first time to have begun to study subjects. Grammar was what he chose. He sought Mentor Graham, the schoolmaster, and asked his advice. "If you are going before the public," Mr. Graham told him, "you ought to do it." But where could he get a grammar? There was but one in the neighborhood, Mr. Graham said, and that was 6 miles away. Without waiting for more information, the young man rose from the breakfast table, walked immediately to the place, borrowed this rare copy of Kirkham's Grammar, and before night was deep in its mysteries. From that time on, for weeks, he gave every moment of his leisure to mastering the contents of the book. Frequently he asked his friend Greene to hold the book while he recited, and when puzzled by a point, he would consult Mr. Graham. Lincoln's eagerness to learn was such that the whole neighborhood became interested. The Greenes lent him books. The schoolmaster kept him in mind, and helped him as he could. And even the village cooper let him come into his shop and keep up a fire of shavings sufficiently bright to read by at night. It was not long before the grammar was mastered. "Well," Lincoln said to his fellow clerk, Greene, "if that's what they call science, I think I'll go at another." He had made another discovery, that he could conquer subjects. The poor and friendless lad, George Peabody, weary, footsore, and hungry, called at a tavern in Concord, New Hampshire, and asked to be allowed to saw wood for lodging and breakfast. Half a century later he called there again, but then George Peabody was one of the greatest millionaire bankers of the world. Bishop Fowler says, "It is one of the greatest encouragements of our age that ordinary men with extraordinary industry reach the highest stations." Greeley's father, because the boy tried to yoke the off ox on the near side, said, "That boy will never get along in the world. He'll never know enough to come in when it rains." He was too poor to wear stockings, but Horace persevered and became one of the greatest editors of his century. Handel's father hated music, and would not allow a musical instrument in the house. But the boy with an aim secured a little spinet, hid it in the attic where he practiced every minute where he could steal without detection, until he surprised the great players and composers of Europe by his wonderful knowledge of music. He was very practical in his work, and studied the taste and sensitiveness of audiences until he knew exactly what they wanted. Then he would compose something to supply the demand. He analyzed the effect of sounds and combinations of sounds upon the senses, and wrote directly to human needs. His greatest work, The Messiah, was composed in Dublin for the benefit of poor debtors who were imprisoned there. The influence of this masterpiece was tremendous. It was said it outpreached the preacher, outprayed prayers, reformed the wayward, softened stony hearts, as it told the wonderful story of redemption in sound. A.T. Stewart began life as a teacher in New York at $300 a year. He soon resigned and began that career as a merchant in which he achieved a success almost without precedent. Honesty, one price, cash on delivery, and business on business principles were his invariable rules. Absolute regularity and system reigned in every department. In 50 years he made a fortune of from $30 to $40 million. He was nominated as Secretary of the Treasury in 1869, but it was found that the law forbids a merchant to occupy that position. He offered to resign, or to give the entire profits of his business to the poor of New York, as long as he should remain in office. President Grant declined to accept such an offer. Poor Kepler struggled with constant anxieties, and told fortunes by astrology for a livelihood, saying that astrology, as the daughter of astronomy, ought to keep her mother. But fancy a man of science wasting precious time over horoscopes. "I supplicate you," he writes to Maestlin, "if there is a situation vacant at Tübingen, do what you can to obtain it for me, and let me know the prices of bread and wine and other necessaries of life, for my wife is not accustomed to live on beans." He had to accept all sorts of jobs. He made almanacs and served anyone who would pay him. Who would have predicted that the modest, gentle boy Raphael, without either riches or noted family, would have worked his way to such renown, or that one of his pictures, but 66 3/4 inches square, the Mother of Jesus, would be sold to the Empress of Russia for $66,000. His Ansidei Madonna was bought by the National Gallery for $350,000. Think of Michelangelo working for 6 florins a month, and 18 years on St. Peter's for nothing. Dr. Johnson was so afflicted with King's evil that he lost the use of one eye. The youth could not even engage in the pastimes of his mates, as he could not see the gutter without bending his head down near the street. He read and studied terribly. Finally a friend offered to send him to Oxford, but he failed to keep his promise, and the boy had to leave. He returned home, and soon afterward his father died insolvent. He conquered adverse fortune and bodily infirmities with the fortitude of a true hero. Ichabod Washburn, a poor boy born near Plymouth Rock, was apprenticed to a blacksmith in Worcester, Mass., and was so bashful that he scarcely dared to eat in the presence of others. But he determined that he would make the best wire in the world, and would contrive ways and means to manufacture it in enormous quantities. At that time there was no good wire made in the United States. One house in England had the monopoly of making steel wire for pianos for more than a century. Young Washburn, however, had grit, and was bound to succeed. His wire became the standard everywhere. At one time he made 250,000 yards of iron wire daily, consuming 12 tons of metal, and requiring the services of 700 men. He amassed an immense fortune, of which he gave away a large part during his life, and bequeathed the balance to charitable institutions. John Jacob Astor left home at 17 to acquire a fortune. His capital consisted of $2 and 3 resolutions: to be honest, to be industrious, and not to gamble. 2 years later he reached New York, and began work in a fur store at $2 a week and his board. Soon learning the details of the business, he began operations on his own account. By giving personal attention to every purchase and sale, roaming the woods to trade with the Indians, or crossing the Atlantic to sell his furs at a great profit in England, he soon became the leading fur dealer in the United States. His idea of what constitutes a fortune expanded faster than his acquisitions. At 50 he owned millions. At 60 his millions owned him. He invested in land, becoming in time the richest owner of real estate in America. Generous to his family, he seldom gave much for charity. He once subscribed $50 for some benevolent purpose, when one of the committee of solicitation said, "We did hope for more, Mr. Astor. Your son gave us $100. "Ah," chuckled the rich furrier, "William has a rich father. Mine was poor." Elihu Burritt wrote in a diary kept at Worcester, whither he went to enjoy its library privileges. Such entries as these: Monday, June 18. Headache. 40 pages Cuvier's Theory of the Earth. 64 pages of French. 11 hours forging. Tuesday, June 19. 60 lines Hebrew, 30 Danish, 10 lines Bohemian, 9 lines Polish, 15 names of stars, 10 hours forging. Wednesday, June 20. 25 lines Hebrew, 8 lines Syriac, 11 hours forging. He mastered 18 languages and 32 dialects. He became eminent as the learned blacksmith, and for his noble work in the service of humanity. Edward Everett said of the manner in which this boy with no chance acquired great learning, "It is enough to make one who has had good opportunities for education hang his head in shame." "I was born in poverty," said Vice President Henry Wilson. "Want sat by my cradle. I know what it is to ask a mother for bread when she has none to give. I left my home at 10 years of age, and served an apprenticeship of 11 years, receiving a month's schooling each year, and at the end of 11 years of hard work, a yoke of oxen and 6 sheep, which brought me $84. I never spent the sum of $1 for pleasure, counting every penny from the time I was born till I was 21 years of age. I know what it is to travel weary miles and ask my fellow men to give me leave to toil. In the first month after I was 21 years of age, I went into the woods, drove a team, and cut mill logs. I rose in the morning before daylight and worked hard till after dark, and received the magnificent sum of $6 for the month's work. Each of these dollars looked as large to me as the moon looks tonight." "Many a farmer's son," says Thurlow Weed, "has found the best opportunities for mental improvement in his intervals of leisure while tending sap bush. Such, at any rate, was my own experience. At night you had only to feed the kettles and keep up the fires, the sap having been gathered and the wood cut before dark. During the day we would always lay in a good stock of fat pine by the light of which, blazing bright before the sugar house, in the posture the serpent was condemned to assume, as a penalty for tempting our first grandmother, I passed many a delightful night in reading. I remember in this way to have read a history of the French Revolution, and to have obtained from it a better and more enduring knowledge of its events and horrors, and of the actors in that great national tragedy, than I have received from all subsequent reading. I remember also how happy I was in being able to borrow the books of a Mr. Keyes, after a 2-mile tramp through the snow, shoeless, my feet swaddled in remnants of rag carpet." "That fellow will beat us all some day," said a merchant speaking of John Wanamaker and his close attention to his work. "What a prediction to make of a young man who started business with a little clothing and a hand cart in the streets of Philadelphia! But this youth had the indomitable spirit of a conqueror in him, and you could not keep him down. General Grant said to George W. Childs, 'Mr. Wanamaker could command an army.' His great energy, method, industry, economy, and high moral principle attracted President Harrison, who appointed him Postmaster General. Jacques Aristide Boucicault began his business life as an employee in a dry goods house in a small provincial town in France. After a few years he went to Paris, where he prospered so rapidly that in 1853 he became a partner, and later the sole proprietor, of the Bon Marché, then only a small shop, which became under his direction the most unique establishment in the world. His idea was to establish a combined philanthropic and commercial house on a large scale. Everyone who worked for him was advanced progressively, according to his length of employment and the value of the services he rendered. He furnished free tuition, free medical attendance, and a free library for employees, a provident fund affording a small capital for males and a marriage portion for females at the expiration of 10 or 15 years of service, a free reading room for the public, and a free art gallery for artists to exhibit their paintings or sculptures. After his sudden death in 1877, his only son carried forward his father's projects until he too died in 1879, when his widow, Marguerite Guérin, continued and extended his business and beneficent plans until her death in 1887. So well did this family lay the foundations of a building covering 108,000 square feet, with many accessory buildings of smaller size, and of a business employing 3,600 persons, with sales amounting to nearly $20 million annually, that every department is still conducted with all its former success, in accordance with the instructions of the founders. They are here no longer in their bodily presence, but their spirit, their ideas still pervade the vast establishment. Everything is still sold at a small profit, and at a price plainly marked, and any article which may have ceased to please the purchaser can without the slightest difficulty be exchanged or its value refunded. When James Gordon Bennett was 40 years old, he collected all his property, $300, and in a cellar with a board upon 2 barrels for a desk, himself his own typesetter, office boy, publisher, newsboy, clerk, editor, proofreader, and printer's devil, he started the New York Herald. In all his literary work up to this time he had tried to imitate Franklin's style, and, as is the fate of all imitators, he utterly failed. He lost 20 years of his life trying to be somebody else. He first showed the material he was made of in the salutatory of the Herald, viz., "Our only guide shall be good, sound, and practical common sense, applicable to the business and bosoms of men engaged in everyday life. We shall support no party, be the organ of no faction or coterie, and care nothing for any election or any candidate, from president down to constable. We shall endeavor to record facts upon every public and proper subject, stripped of verbiage and coloring, with comments when suitable, just, independent, fearless, and good-tempered." Joseph Hunter was a carpenter, Robert Burns a plowman, Keats a druggist, Thomas Carlyle a mason, Hugh Miller a stonemason. Rubens the artist was a page, Swedenborg a mining engineer, Dante and Descartes were soldiers. Ben Jonson was a bricklayer, and worked at building Lincoln Inn in London, with trowel in hand and a book in his pocket. Jeremy Taylor was a barber. Andrew Johnson was a tailor. Cardinal Wolsey was a butcher's son. So were Defoe and Kirke White. Michael Faraday was the son of a blacksmith. He even excelled his teacher, Sir Humphrey Davy, who was an apprentice to an apothecary. Virgil was the son of a porter, Homer of a farmer, Pope of a merchant, Horace of a shopkeeper, Demosthenes of a cutler, Milton of a money scrivener, Shakespeare of a wool stapler, and Oliver Cromwell of a brewer. John Wanamaker's first salary was $1.25 per week. A.T. Stewart began his business life as a school teacher. James Keene drove a milk wagon in a California town. Joseph Pulitzer, proprietor of the New York World, once acted as a stoker on a Mississippi steamboat. When a young man, Cyrus Field was a clerk in a New England store. George W. Childs was an errand boy for a bookseller at $4 a month. Andrew Carnegie began work in a Pittsburgh telegraph office at $3 a week. C.P. Huntington sold butter and eggs for what he could get a pound a dozen. Whitelaw Reid was once a correspondent of a newspaper in Cincinnati at $5 per week. Adam Forepaugh was once a butcher in Philadelphia. Sarah Bernhardt was a dressmaker's apprentice. Adelaide Neilson began life as a child's nurse. Miss Braddon, the novelist, was a utility actress in the provinces. Charlotte Cushman was the daughter of poor people. Mr. W. O. Stoddard, in his Men of Business, tells a characteristic story of the late Leland Stanford. When 18 years of age, his father purchased a tract of woodland, but had not the means to clear it as he wished. He told Leland that he could have all he could make from the timber if he would leave the land clear of trees. A new market had just then been created for cordwood, and Leland took some money that he had saved, hired other choppers to help him, and sold over 2,000 cords of wood to the Mohawk and Hudson River Railroad at a net profit of $2,600. He used this sum to start him in his law studies, and thus, as Mr. Stoddard says, chopped his way to the bar. It is said that the career of Benjamin Franklin is full of inspiration for any young man. When he left school for good, he was only 12 years of age. At first he did little but read. He soon found, however, that reading alone would not make him an educated man, and he proceeded to act upon this discovery at once. At school he had been unable to understand arithmetic. Twice he had given it up as a hopeless puzzle, and finally left school almost hopelessly ignorant upon the subject. But the printer's boy soon found his ignorance of figures extremely inconvenient. When he was about 14, he took up for the third time the Cocker's arithmetic, which had baffled him at school, and ciphered all through it with ease and pleasure. He then mastered a work upon navigation, which included the rudiments of geometry, and thus tasted, "the inexhaustible charm of mathematics." He pursued a similar course, we are told, in acquiring the art of composition, in which, at length, he excelled most of the men of his time. When he was but a boy of 16, he wrote so well that the pieces which he slyly sent to his brother's paper were thought to have been written by some of the most learned men in the colony. Henry Clay, the mill boy of the Slashes, was one of 7 children of a widow too poor to send him to any but a common country school, where he was drilled only in the 3 R's. But he used every spare moment to study without a teacher, and in after years he was a king among self-made men. The most successful man is he who has triumphed over obstacles, disadvantages, and discouragements. It is Goodyear in his rude laboratory, enduring poverty and failure until the pasty rubber is at length hardened. It is Edison biding his time in baggage car and in printing office until that mysterious light and power glows and throbs at his command. It is Carey on his cobbler's bench, nourishing the great purpose that at length carried the message of love to benighted India. These are the cases and examples of true success. End of chapter 3. Recording by David Martin.
Chapter 4 of How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 4. Out of Place. The high prize of life, the crowning fortune of a man, is to be born with a bias to some pursuit which finds him in employment and happiness. Emerson. The art of putting the right man in the right place is perhaps the first in the science of government, but the art of finding a satisfactory position for the discontented is the most difficult. Talleyrand. It is a celebrated thought of Socrates, that if all the misfortunes of mankind were cast into a public stock, in order to be equally distributed among the whole species, those who now think themselves the most unhappy would prefer the share they are already possessed of, before that which would fall to them by such a division. Addison. I was born to other things. Tennyson. How many a rustic Milton has passed by, stifling the speechless longings of his heart in unremitting drudgery and care. How many a vulgar Cato has compelled his energies, no longer tameless then, to mould a pin or fabricate a nail. Shelley. "But I'm good for something," pleaded a young man whom a merchant was about to discharge for his bluntness. "You are good for nothing as a salesman," said his employer. "I am sure I can be useful," said the youth. "How? Tell me how." "I don't know, sir, I don't know." "Nor do I," said the merchant, laughing at the earnestness of his clerk. "Only don't put me away, sir, don't put me away. Try me at something besides selling." "I cannot sell, I know I cannot sell." "I know that too," said the principal. "That is what's wrong." "But I can make myself useful somehow," persisted the young man. "I know I can." He was placed in the counting house, where his aptitude for figures soon showed itself, and in a few years he became not only chief cashier in the large store, but an eminent accountant. "Out of an art," says Bulwer, "a man may be so trivial you would mistake him for an imbecile, at best a grown infant. Put him into his art, and how high he soars above you! How quietly he enters into a heaven of which he has become a denizen, and unlocking the gates with his golden key, admits you to follow, an humble reverent visitor." A man out of place is like a fish out of water. Its fins mean nothing, they are only a hindrance. The fish can do nothing but flounder out of its element, but as soon as the fins feel the water they mean something. 52% of our college graduates studied law, not because in many cases they have the slightest natural aptitude for it, but because it is put down as the proper road to promotion. A man never grows in personal power and moral stamina when out of his place. If he grows at all, it is a narrow, one-sided, stunted growth, not a manly growth. Nature abhors the slightest perversion of natural aptitude or deviation from the sealed orders which accompany every soul into this world. A man out of place is not half a man. He feels unmanned, unsexed. He cannot respect himself, hence he cannot be respected. You can enter all kinds of horses for a race, but only those which have natural adaptation for speed will make records. The others will only make themselves ridiculous by their lumbering, unnatural exertions to win. How many truck and family horse lawyers make themselves ridiculous by trying to speed on the law track, where courts and juries only laugh at them. The effort to redeem themselves from scorn may enable them by unnatural exertions to become fairly passable, but the same efforts along the line of their strength or adaptation would make them kings in their line. "Jonathan," said Mr. Chase, when his son told of having nearly fitted himself for college, "thou shalt go down to the machine shop on Monday morning." It was many years before Jonathan escaped from the shop to work his way up to the position of a man of great influence as a United States Senator from Rhode Island. Galileo was sent to the University at Pisa at 17, with the strict injunction not to neglect medical subjects for the alluring study of philosophy or literature. But when he was 18 he discovered the great principle of the pendulum by a lamp left swinging in the cathedral. John Adams' father was a shoemaker, and trying to teach his son the art, gave him some uppers to cut out by a pattern which had a 3-cornered hole in it to hang it up by. the future statesman followed the pattern, whole and all. There is a tradition that Tennyson's first poems were published at the instigation of his father's coachman. His grandfather gave the lad 10 shillings for writing an elegy on his grandmother. As he handed it to him, he said, "There, that's the first money you ever earned by your poetry, and take my word for it, it will be the last." Murillo's mother had marked her boy for a priest, but nature had already laid her hand upon him and marked him for her own. His mother was shocked on returning from church one day to find that the child had taken down the sacred family picture, Jesus and the Lamb, and had painted his own hat on the Saviour's head, and had changed the lamb into a dog. The poor boy's home was broken up, and he started out on foot and alone to seek his fortune. All he had was courage and determination to make something of himself. He not only became a famous artist, but a man of great character. "Let us people who are so uncommonly clever and learned," says Thackeray, "have a great tenderness and pity for the folks who are not endowed with the prodigious talents which we have. I have always had a regard for dunces. Those of my own school days were among the pleasantest of the fellows, and have turned out by no means the dullest in life; whereas many a youth who could turn off Latin hexameters by the yard and construe Greek quite glibly, is no better than a feeble prig now, with not a pennyworth more brains than were in his head before his beard grew." In the winter of 1824 there set in a great flood upon the town of Sidmouth. The tide rose to a terrible height. In the midst of this sublime and terrible storm, Dame Partington, who lived upon the beach, was seen at the door of her house, with mop and pattens, trundling her mop, squeezing out the sea water, and vigorously pushing away the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic was roused. Mrs. Partington's spirit was up, but I need not tell you the contest was unequal. The Atlantic Ocean beat Mrs. Partington. She was excellent as a slop or a puddle, but she should not have meddled with a tempest. How many Dame Partingtons there are, of both sexes, and in every walk of life! The young swan is restless and uneasy until she finds the element she has never before seen. Then, with arched neck, between her white wings mantling proudly, rose her state with oary feet. What a wretched failure was that of Haydon the painter! He thought he failed through the world's ingratitude or injustice, but his failure was due wholly to his being out of place. His bitter disappointments at his half successes were really pitiable, because to him they were more than failures. He had not the slightest sense of color, yet went through life under the delusion that he was an artist. "If it is God's will to take any of my children by death, I hope it may be Isaac," said the father of Dr. Isaac Barrow. "Why do you tell that blockhead the same thing 20 times over?" asked John Wesley's father. "Because," replied his mother, "if I had told him but 19 times, all my labor would have been lost, while now he will understand and remember." A man out of place may manage to get a living, but he has lost the buoyancy, energy, and enthusiasm which are as natural to a man in his place as his breath. He is industrious, but he works mechanically and without heart. It is to support himself and family, not because he cannot help it. Dinner time does not come 2 hours before he realizes it. A man out of place is constantly looking at his watch and thinking of his salary. If a man is in his place, he is happy, joyous, cheerful, energetic, fertile in resources. The days are too short for him. All his faculties give their consent to his work, say yes to his occupation. He is a man. He respects himself and is happy because all his powers are at play in their natural sphere. There is no compromising of his faculties, no cramping of legal acumen upon the farm, no suppressing of forensic oratorical powers at the shoemaker's bench, no stifling of exuberance of physical strength, of visions of golden crops and blooded cattle amid the loved country life in the dry clergyman's study, composing sermons to put the congregation to sleep. To be out of place is demoralizing to all the powers of manhood. We can't cheat nature out of her aim. If she has set all the currents of your life toward medicine or law, you will only be a botch at anything else. Will power and application cannot make a farmer of a born painter, any more than a lumbering draft horse can be changed into a race horse. When the powers are not used along the line of their strength they become demoralized, weakened, deteriorated. Self-respect, enthusiasm and courage ooze out. We become half-hearted and success is impossible. Scott was called the great blockhead while in Edinburgh College. Grant's mother called the future general and president "Useless Grant," because he was so unhandy and dull. Erskine had at length found his place as a lawyer. He carried everything before him at the bar. Had he remained in the navy he would probably never have been heard from. When elected to Parliament his lofty spirit was chilled by the cold sarcasm and contemptuous indifference of Pitt, whom he was expected by his friends to annihilate. But he was again out of his place. He was shorn of his magic power, and his eloquent tongue faltered from a consciousness of being out of his place. Gould failed as a storekeeper, tanner and surveyor and civil engineer, before he got into a railroad office where he "struck his gait." When extracts from James Russell Lowell's poem at Harvard were shown his father at Rome, instead of being pleased, the latter said, "James promised me when I left home that he would give up poetry and stick to books. I had hoped that he had become less flighty." The world is full of people at war with their positions. Man only grows when he is developing along the lines of his own individuality, and not when he is trying to be somebody else. All attempts to imitate another man, when there is no one like you in all creation, as the pattern was broken when you were born, is not only to ruin your own pattern, but to make only an echo of the one imitated. There is no strength off the lines of our own individuality. Anywhere else we are dwarfs, weaklings, echoes, and the echo even of a great man is a sorry contrast to even the smallest human being, who is himself. End of chapter 4. Recording by Lee Smalley.
Chapter 5 of How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 5. What Shall I Do? No man ever made an ill figure who understood his own talents, nor a good one who mistook them. Swift. Blessed is he who has found his work. Let him ask no other blessing. Carlyle. Whatever you are by nature, keep to it. Never desert your line of talent. Be what nature intended you for, and you will succeed. Be anything else, and you will be 10,000 times worse than nothing. Sydney Smith. He who is false to present duty breaks a thread in the loom, and will find the flaw when he may have forgotten its cause. Beecher. I am glad to think I am not bound to make the world go round, but only to discover and to do with cheerful heart the work that God appoints. Jean Ingelow. Do that which is assigned you, says Emerson, and you cannot hope too much or dare too much. There is at this moment for you an utterance brave and grand as that of the colossal chisel of Phidias, or trowel of the Egyptians, or the pen of Moses or Dante, but different from all these. I felt that I was in the world to do something, and thought I must, said Whittier, thus giving the secret of his great power. It is the man who must enter law, literature, medicine, the ministry, or any other of the overstocked professions, who will succeed. His certain call, that is, his love for it, and his fidelity to it, are the imperious factors of his career. If a man enters a profession simply because his grandfather made a great name in it, or his mother wants him to, with no love or adaptability for it, it were far better for him to be a day laborer. In the humbler work his intelligence may make him a leader. In the other career he might do as much harm as a boulder rolled from its place upon a railroad track, a menace to the next express. Lowell said, "It is the vain endeavor to make ourselves what we are not that has strewn history with so many broken purposes and lives left in the rough." "The age has no aversion to preaching as such," said Phillips Brooks. "It may not listen to your preaching. But though it may not listen to your preaching, it will wear your boots, or buy your flour, or see stars through your telescope. It has a use for every person, and it is his business to find out what that use is." The following advertisement appeared several times in a paper without bringing a letter: "Wanted. Situation by a practical printer, who is competent to take charge of any department in a printing and publishing house. Would accept a professorship in any of the academies. Has no objection to teach ornamental painting and penmanship, geometry, trigonometry, and many other sciences. Has had some experience as a lay preacher. Would have no objection to form a small class of young ladies and gentlemen to instruct them in the higher branches. To a dentist or chiropodist he would be invaluable, or he would cheerfully accept a position as bass or tenor singer in a choir." At length there appeared this addition to the notice: "P.S. Will accept an offer to saw and split wood at less than the usual rates." This secured a situation at once, and the advertisement was seen no more. Don't wait for a higher position or a larger salary. Enlarge the position you already occupy. Put originality of method into it. Fill it as it never was filled before. Be more prompt, more energetic, more thorough, more polite than your predecessor or fellow workman. Study your business, devise new modes of operation, be able to give your employer points. The art lies not in giving satisfaction merely, not in simply filling your place, but in doing better than was expected, in surprising your employer, and the reward will be a better place and a larger salary. "He that hath a trade," says Franklin, "hath an estate, and he that hath a calling hath a place of profit and honor. A plowman on his legs is higher than a gentleman on his knees." Follow your bent. You cannot long fight successfully against your aspirations. Parents, friends, or misfortune may stifle and suppress the longings of the heart, by compelling you to perform unwelcome tasks. But, like a volcano, the inner fire will burst the crusts which confine it and pour forth its pent-up genius and eloquence in song, in art, or in some favorite industry. Beware of a talent which you cannot hope to practice in perfection. Nature hates all botched and half-finished work, and will pronounce her curse upon it. Your talent is your call. Your legitimate destiny speaks in your character. If you have found your place, your occupation has the consent of every faculty of your being. If possible, choose that occupation which focuses the largest amount of your experience and tastes. You will then not only have a congenial vocation, but will utilize largely your skill and business knowledge, which is your true capital. There is no doubt that every person has a special adaptation for his own peculiar part in life. A very few, the geniuses we call them, have this marked in an unusual degree and very early in life. A man's business does more to make him than anything else. It hardens his muscles, strengthens his body, quickens his blood, sharpens his mind, corrects his judgment, wakes up his inventive genius, puts his wits to work, starts him on the race of life, arouses his ambition, makes him feel that he is a man and must fill a man's shoes, do a man's work, bear a man's part in life, and show himself a man in that part. No man feels himself a man who is not doing a man's business. A man without employment is not a man. He does not prove by his works that he is a man. 150 pounds of bone and muscle do not make a man. A good cranium full of brains is not a man. The bone and muscle and brain must know how to do a man's work, think a man's thoughts, mark out a man's path, and bear a man's weight of character and duty before they constitute a man. Whatever you do in life, be greater than your calling. Most people look upon an occupation or calling as a mere expedient for earning a living. What a mean, narrow view to take of what was intended for the great school of life, the great man developer, the character builder, that which should broaden, deepen, heighten, and round out into symmetry, harmony, and beauty, all the God-given faculties within us. How we shrink from the task and evade the lessons which were intended for the unfolding of life's great possibilities into usefulness and power, as the sun unfolds into beauty and fragrance the petals of the flower. "Girls, you cheapen yourselves by lack of purpose in life," says Rena L. Miner. "You show commendable zeal in pursuing your studies. Your alertness in comprehending and ability in surmounting difficult problems have become proverbial. 9 times out of 10 you outrank your brothers thus far, but when the end is attained, the goal reached, whether it be the graduating certificate from a graded school or a college diploma, for 9 out of every 10 it might as well be added thereto, dead to further activity, or sleeping until marriage shall resurrect her." Crocheting, placking, dressing, visiting, music, and flirtations make up the sum total for the expense and labor expended for your existence. If forced to earn your support, you are content to stand behind a counter, or teach school term after term in the same grade, while the young men who graduated with you walk up the grades, as up a ladder, to professorship and good salary, from which they swing off into law, physics, or perhaps the legislative firmament, leaving difficulties and obstacles like nebula in their wake. You girls, satisfied with mediocrity, have an eye mainly for the main chance, marriage. If you marry wealthy, which is marrying well according to the modern popular idea, you dress more elegantly, cultivate more fashionable society, leave your thinking for your husband and your minister to do for you, and become in the economy of life but a sentient nonentity. If you are true to the grand passion and accept with it poverty, you bake, brew, scrub, spank the children, and talk with your neighbor over the back fence for recreation, spending the years literally like the horse in a treadmill, all for the lack of a purpose sufficiently potent to convert the latent talent into a gem of living beauty, a creative force which makes all adjuncts secondary, like planets to their central sun. Choose some one course or calling, and master it in all its details. Sleep by it, swear by it, work for it, and if marriage crowns you, it can but add new glory to your labor. Dr. Hall says that the world has urgent need of girls who are mother's right hand, girls who can cuddle the little ones next best to mamma, and smooth out the tangles in the domestic skein when things get twisted, girls whom father takes comfort in for something better than beauty, and the big brothers are proud of for something that outranks the ability to dance or shine in society. Next, we want girls of sense. Girls who have a standard of their own regardless of conventionalities, and are independent enough to live up to it. Girls who simply won't wear a trailing dress on the street to gather up microbes and all sorts of defilement. Girls who don't wear a high hat to the theater, or lacerate their feet with high heels and endanger their health with corsets. Girls who will wear what is pretty and becoming, and snap their fingers at the dictates of fashion when fashion is horrid and silly. And we want good girls, girls who are sweet, right straight out from the heart to the lips, innocent and pure and simple girls, with less knowledge of sin and duplicity and evil doing at 20 than the pert little schoolgirl of 10 has all too often. And we want careful girls and prudent girls who think enough of the generous father who toils to maintain them in comfort, and of the gentle mother who denies herself much that they may have so many pretty things, to count the cost and draw the line between the essentials and non-essentials. girls who strive to save and not to spend, girls who are unselfish and eager to be a joy and a comfort in the home rather than an expense and a useless burden. We want girls with hearts, girls who are full of tenderness and sympathy, with tears that flow for other people's ills, and smiles that light outward their own beautiful thoughts. We have lots of clever girls and brilliant girls and witty girls. Give us a consignment of jolly girls, warm-hearted and impulsive girls, kind and entertaining to their own folks, and with little desire to shine in the garish world. With a few such girls scattered around, life would freshen up for all of us, as the weather does under the spell of summer showers. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Pamela Krantz.
Chapter 6 of How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 6. Will you pay the price? The gods sell anything, and to everybody at a fair price. Emerson. All desire knowledge, but no one is willing to pay the price. Juvenal. There is no royal path which leads to geometry. Euclid. There is no road to success but through a clear, strong purpose. A purpose underlies character, culture, position, attainment of whatever sort. T. T. Munger. Remember, you have not a sinew whose law of strength is not action. You have not a faculty of body, mind, or soul whose law of improvement is not energy. E. B. Hall. We have but what we make, and every good is locked by nature in a granite hand. Sheer labor must unclench. Oh, if I could thus put a dream on canvas, exclaimed an enthusiastic young artist, pointing to a most beautiful painting. Dream on canvas, growled the master. It is the 10,000 touches with the brush you must learn to put on canvas that make your dream. There is but one method of attaining excellence, said Sydney Smith, and that is hard labor. If only Milton's imagination could have conceived his visions, says Waters, his consummate industry alone could have carved the immortal lines which enshrine them. If only Newton's mind could reach out to the secrets of nature, even his genius could only do it by the homeliest toil. The works of Bacon are not Midsummer Night's Dreams, but like coral islands they have risen from the depths of truth, and formed their broad surfaces above the ocean by the minutest accretions of persevering labor. The conceptions of Michelangelo would have perished like a night's fantasy had not his industry given them permanence. Salvini contributes the following to the Century as to his habits of study before he had established himself as a past master of tragedy. I imposed upon myself a new method of study. While I was busying myself with the part of Saul, I read and reread the Bible, so as to become impregnated with the appropriate sentiments, manners, and local color. When I took up Othello, I pored over the history of the Venetian Republic and that of the Moorish invasion of Spain. I studied the passions of the Moors, their art of war, their religious beliefs, nor did I overlook the romance of Giraldi Cinthio in order the better to master that sublime character. I did not concern myself about a superficial study of the words, or of some point of scenic effect, or of greater or less accentuation of certain phrases with a view to win passing applause. A vaster horizon opened out before me, an infinite sea on which my bark could navigate in security, without fear of falling in with reefs. His method was not new, but he considered it so, and gives his opinion in quotation marks. He speaks of characters with which his name is not always associated by writers on the stage, but is correct, I think, in the main. Many years ago, a little boy entered Harrow School and was put in a class beyond his years, wherein all the other boys had the advantage of previous instruction. His master used to reprove his dullness, but all his efforts could not raise him from the lowest place in the class. The boy finally procured the elementary books which the other boys had studied. He devoted the hours of play and many of the hours of sleep to mastering the elementary principles of these books. This boy was soon at the head of his class, and the pride of Harrow. The statue of that boy, Sir William Jones, stands today in St. Paul's Cathedral, for he lived to be the greatest Oriental scholar of Europe. "What is the secret of success in business?" asked a friend of Cornelius Vanderbilt. "Secret? There is no secret about it," replied the Commodore. "All you have to do is to attend to your business and go ahead. If you would adopt Vanderbilt's method, know your business, attend to it, and keep down expenses until your fortune is safe from business perils. Work or starve is nature's motto, and it is written on the stars and the sod alike. Starve mentally, starve morally, starve physically. It is an inexorable law of nature that whatever is not used dies. Nothing for nothing is her maxim. If we are idle and shiftless by choice, we shall be nerveless and powerless by necessity." The mottos of great men often give us glimpses of the secret of their characters and success. "Work, work, work," was the motto of Sir Joshua Reynolds, David Wilkie, and scores of other men who have left their mark upon the world. Voltaire's motto was toujours au travail, always at work. Scott's maxim was, never be doing nothing. Michelangelo was a wonderful worker. He even slept in his clothes, ready to spring to his work as soon as he awoke. He kept a block of marble in his bedroom that he might get up in the night and work when he could not sleep. His favorite device was an old man in a go-cart, with an hourglass upon it, bearing this inscription, "Ancora imparo," still I'm learning. Even after he was blind, he would ask to be wheeled into the Belvedere to examine the statues with his hands. Cobden used to say, "I'm working like a horse without a moment to spare." It was said that Handel, the musician, did the work of a dozen men. Nothing ever daunted him. He feared neither ridicule nor defeat. Lord Palmerston worked like a slave, even in his old age. Being asked when he considered a man in his prime, he replied, 79, that being his own age. Humboldt was one of the world's great workers. In summer he arose at 4 in the morning for 30 years. He used to say work was as much of a necessity as eating or sleeping. Sir Walter Scott was a phenomenal worker. He wrote the Waverley novels at the rate of 12 volumes a year. He averaged a volume every 2 months during his whole working life. What an example is this to the young men of today of the possibilities of an earnest life. Edmund Burke was one of the most prodigious workers that ever lived. George Stephenson used to work at mealtime, getting out loads of coal while the miners were at dinner, in order that he might earn a few extra shillings to buy a spelling book and an arithmetic. His associates thought he was very foolish, and asked him what good it would do to learn to read and cipher. He told them he was determined to improve his mind, so he studied whenever he could snatch a minute before the engines fire, and in every possible situation, until he had a good, practical, common-sense education. Garibaldi's father decided that Giuseppe should be a minister, because the boy was so sorry for a cricket which lost its leg. Samuel Morse's father concluded that his son would preach well, because he could not keep his head above water in a dangerous attempt to catch bait in the Mystic River. President Dwight told young Morse he would never make a painter, and hinted that he would never amount to much anyway if he did not study more. Although under the teaching of West and Alston in London, he became a tolerable portrait painter, he did not find his sphere until returning from England on a sailing vessel. He heard Professor Jackson explain an electrical experiment in Paris, when the thought of the telegraph flashed into his mind, and he found no rest until he flashed over the wire the first message, "What hath God wrought?" on the experimental line between Baltimore and Washington. This was May 24, 1844. William H. Vanderbilt was by far the wealthiest man in the world. Chauncey M. Depew estimated his fortune at 200 millions. He left his 8 children 10 millions each, except Cornelius and William K., who had 65 millions each. Commodore Vanderbilt, his father, amassed a fortune of $80 millions in his own lifetime, and that too at a time when it was more difficult to make money than it is now. Mr. C. P. Huntington is a good example of a self-made man. His father was a Connecticut farmer. The farm was left to him, but he traded it off for a lot of clocks which he peddled in mining districts for gold dust and nuggets. He and Mark Hopkins formed a partnership and opened a hardware store in California. They united with Leland Stanford in the construction of a railroad, and they all got rich rapidly. Mr. Huntington is one of the greatest railroad operators of the country. He always acted upon the principle that he would control the stock of any road in which he was interested. He is one of the most methodical men of all the millionaires of this country. He is very plain in his manner, strictly temperate, and very abstemious in his living. He said he never knew what it was to be tired. Russell Sage used to keep a grocery store in Troy, New York. He finally associated himself with Jay Gould, who used to be a constant borrower of money of him. Mr. Sage probably keeps more ready money on hand than any other millionaire. He can nearly always control 10 millions or more at call. He has never speculated in stocks to any extent. Mr. Sage's word is as good as any bond. He has no taste for ordinary diversions except driving. Philip D. Armour, who has the appearance of a prosperous farmer, was born on a farm near Watertown, New Jersey. He became fired with a desire to see the "boundless West." His mind seemed to run to hogs, and with a financial instinct he made up his mind that there was a fortune in transporting the hogs from where they were so plenty to where there were so few of them and so many to eat them. He could now purchase every hog in the world, and then have money left to buy a railroad or two. Mrs. Hetty Green is probably the richest woman in the world. Her fortune has grown from the little industry of her father in New Bedford, Massachusetts. She has raised the 9 millions left her by her father, and 9 millions left her by her aunt, to 30 millions. She is a woman of great ability and courage. She once took with her $5 millions of securities in a satchel on a streetcar to deposit with her banker on Wall Street. The probabilities are that billionaires will be as plentiful in the 20th century as millionaires are today, through hard work, self-denial, rigid economy, method, accuracy, and strict temperance, for not one of the self-made millionaires are intemperate. John D. Rockefeller never tastes intoxicating liquor. He seems as unvarying in his method and system as the laws of the universe. Jay Gould did not use wine or intoxicating liquor of any kind. Mr. Huntington does not even drink coffee, while William Waldorf Astor merely takes a sip of wine for courtesy's sake. Not one of the leading millionaires uses tobacco, and not one of them is profane. Very rich men are almost always honest in their dealings, so far as their word is concerned. William Waldorf Astor, until recently, has been considered the richest man in the world, but John D. Rockefeller surpasses him now, it is said. The whole wealth of Croesus was little more than the income of this modern Croesus for 1 year. Mr. Rockefeller controls about 80 or 90 millions of capital stock in the Standard Oil Trust. The Standard Oil Company is one of the best managed corporations in the world. 2 centuries and a quarter ago, a little tempest-tossed, weather-beaten bark, barely escaped from the jaws of the wild Atlantic, landed upon the bleakest shore of New England. From her deck disembarked 101 careworn exiles. To the casual observer, no event could seem more insignificant. The contemptuous eye of the world scarcely deigned to notice it. Yet the famous vessel that bore Caesar and his fortunes carried but an ignoble freight compared with that of the Mayflower. Though landed by a treacherous pilot upon a barren and inhospitable coast, they sought neither richer fields nor a more congenial climate, but liberty and opportunity. A lady once asked Turner the secret of his great success. "I have no secret, madam, but hard work." This is a secret that many never learn, and they don't succeed because they fail to learn it. Labor is the genius that changes the world from ugliness to beauty, and the great curse to a great blessing. See Balzac in his lonely garret, toiling, toiling, waiting, waiting amid poverty and hunger, but neither hunger, debt, poverty, nor discouragement could induce him to swerve a hair's breadth from his purpose. He could wait even while the world scoffed. "Mankind is more indebted to industry than to ingenuity," says Addison. "The gods set up their favors at a price, and industry is the purchaser." Rome was a mighty nation while industry led her people, but when her great conquests of wealth and slaves placed her citizens above work, that moment her glory began to fade, and vice and corruption, induced by idleness, doomed the proud city to an ignominious history. Even Cicero, Rome's great orator, said, "All artisans are engaged in a disgraceful occupation." And Aristotle said, "The best regulated states will not permit a mechanic to be a citizen, for it is impossible for one who lives the life of a mechanic or hired servant to practice a life of virtue. Some were born to be slaves." But fortunately there came a mightier than Rome, Cicero or Aristotle, whose magnificent life and example forever lifted the false ban from labor and redeemed it from disgrace. He gave dignity to the most menial service, and significance to labor. Christ did not say, "Come unto me, all ye pleasure hunters, ye indolent and ye lazy, but come all ye that labor and are heavy laden. Columbus was a persistent and practical, as well as an intellectual hero. He went from one state to another, urging kings and emperors to undertake the first visiting of a world which his instructed spirit already discerned in the far-off seas. He first tried his own countrymen at Genoa, but found none ready to help him. He then went to Portugal, and submitted his project to John II, who laid it before his council. It was scouted as extravagant and chimerical. Nevertheless, the king endeavored to steal Columbus's idea. A fleet was sent north in the direction indicated by the navigator, but being frustrated by storms and winds, it returned to Lisbon after 4 days' voyaging. Columbus returned to Genoa, and again renewed his propositions to the Republic, but without success. Nothing discouraged him. The finding of the New World was the irrevocable object of his life. He went to Spain, and landed at the town of Palos, in Andalusia. He went, by chance, to a convent of Franciscans, knocked at the door, and asked for a little bread and water. The prior gratefully received the stranger, entertained him, and learned from him the story of his life. He encouraged him in his hopes, and furnished him with an admission to the court of Spain, then at Cordova. King Ferdinand received him graciously, but before coming to a decision, he desired to lay the project before a council of his wisest men at Salamanca. Columbus had to reply, not only to the scientific arguments laid before him, but to citations from the Bible. The Spanish clergy declared that the theory of the Antipodes was hostile to the faith. The earth, they said, was an immense flat disk, and if there was a new earth beyond the ocean, then all men could not be descended from Adam. Columbus was considered a fool. Still bent on his idea, he wrote to the King of England, then to the King of France, without effect. At last, in 1492, Columbus was introduced by Louis de Saint Angel to Queen Isabella of Spain. The friends who accompanied him pleaded his cause with so much force and conviction that he at length persuaded the Queen to aid him. Lord Ellenborough was a great worker. He had a very hard time in getting a start at the bar, but was determined never to relax his industry until success came to him. When he was worked down to absolute exhaustion, he had this card which he kept constantly before his eyes, lest he might be tempted to relax his efforts. Quote, "Read or starve." Unquote. Show me a man who has made $50,000, and I will show you in that man an equivalent of energy, attention to detail, trustworthiness, punctuality, professional knowledge, good address, common sense, and other marketable qualities. The farmer respects his savings bank book not unnaturally, for it declares with all the solemnity of a sealed and stamped document that for a certain length of time he rose at 6 o'clock each morning to oversee his labors, that he patiently waited upon seasonable weather, that he understood buying and selling. To the medical man, his fee serves as a medal to indicate that he was brave enough to face smallpox and other infectious diseases, and his self-respect is fostered thereby. The barrister's brief is marked with the price of his legal knowledge, of his eloquence, or of his brave endurance during a period of hope-deferred brieflessness. A rich man asked Howard Burnett to do a little thing for his album. Burnett complied and charged 1,000 francs. "But it took you only 5 minutes," objected the rich man. "Yes, but it took me 30 years to learn how to do it in 5 minutes." "I prepared that sermon," said a young sprig of divinity, "in half an hour, and preached it at once, and thought nothing of it." "In that," said an older minister, "your hearers are at one with you, for they also thought nothing of it." Virgil seems to have accomplished about 4 lines a week, but then they have lasted 1800 years, and will last 1800 more. 7 years Virgil is said to have expended in the composition of the Georgics, and they could all be printed in about 7 columns of an ordinary newspaper. Tradition reports that he was in the habit of composing a few lines in the morning, and spending the rest of the day in polishing them. Campbell used to say that if a poet made 1 good line a week, he did very well indeed. But Moore thought that if a poet did his duty, he could get a line done every day. What an army of young men enters the success contest every year as raw recruits! Many of them are country youths flocking to the cities to buy success. Their young ambitions have been excited by some book, or fired by the story of some signal success, and they dream of becoming Astors or Gerards, Stuarts or Wanamakers, Vanderbilts or Goulds, Lincolns or Garfields, until their innate energy impels them to try their own fortune in the magic metropolis. But what are you willing to pay for "success," as you call it, young man? Do you realize what that word means in a great city in the 19th century, where men grow gray at 30 and die of old age at 40? Where the race of life has become so intense that the runners are treading on the heels of those before them, and "woe to him who stops to tie his shoestring." Do you know that only 2 or 3 out of every 100 will ever win permanent success, and only because they have kept everlastingly at it, and that the rest will sooner or later fail, and many die in poverty because they have given up the struggle? There are multitudes of men who never rely wholly upon themselves and achieve independence. They are like summer vines which never grow even ligneous, but stretch out 1,000 little hands to grasp the stronger shrubs, and if they cannot reach them, they lie disheveled in the grass, hoof-trodden and beaten of every storm. It will be found that the first real movement upward will not take place until, in a spirit of resolute self-denial, indolence so natural to almost everyone is mastered. Necessity is, usually, the spur that sets the sluggish energies in motion. Poverty, therefore, is often of inestimable value as an incentive to the best endeavors of which we are capable. End of chapter 6. Recording by David Martin.
Chapter 7 of How to Succeed or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tech Savvy. How to Succeed or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 7. Foundation Stones. In all matters, before beginning, a diligent preparation should be made. Cicero. How great soever a genius may be, certain it is that he will never shine in his full lustre, nor shed the full influence he is capable of, unless to his own experience he adds that of other men and other ages. By Bolingbroke. It is for want of the little that human means must add to the wonderful capacity for improvement, born in man, that by far the greatest part of the intellect, innate in our race, perishes undeveloped and unknown. by Edward Everett. If any man fancies that there is some easier way of gaining a dollar than by squarely earning it, he has lost his clue to his way through this moral labyrinth, and must henceforth wander as chance may dictate. By Horace Greeley. What we do upon some great occasion will probably depend on what we already are, and what we are will be the result of previous years of self-discipline. By H. P. Liddon. Learn to labor and to wait. By Longfellow. What avails all this sturdiness? asked an oak tree which had grown solitary for 200 years, bitterly handled by frosts and wrestled by winds. Why am I to stand here useless? My roots are anchored in rifts of rocks. No herds can lie down under my shadow. I am far above singing birds, that seldom come to rest among my leaves. I am set as a mark for storms, that bend and tear me. My fruit is serviceable for no appetite. It had been better for me to have been a mushroom, gathered in the morning for some poor man's table, than to be 100-year oak, good for nothing. While it yet spoke, the axe was hewing at its base. It died in sadness, saying as it fell, "Weary ages for nothing have I lived." The axe completed its work. By and by the trunk and root formed the knees of a stately ship, bearing the country's flag around the world. Other parts form keel and ribs of merchantmen, and having defied the mountain storms, they now equally resist the thunder of the waves and murky threat of scowling hurricanes. Other parts are laid into floors, or wrought into wainscoting, or carved for frames of noble pictures, or fashioned into chairs that embosom the weakness of old age. Thus the tree, in dying, come not to its end, but to its beginning of life. It voyaged the world. It grew to parts of temples and dwellings. It held upon its surface the soft tread of children and tottering steps of patriarchs. It rocked in the cradle. It swayed the limbs of age by the chimney corner, and heard, secure within, the roar of those old unwearied tempests that once surged about its mountain life. All its early struggles and hardships had enabled it to grow tough, and hard and beautiful of grain, alike useful and ornamental. "Sir, you have been to college, I presume?" asked an illiterate but boastful exhorter of a clergyman. "Yes, sir," was the reply. "I am thankful," said the former, "that the Lord opened my mouth without any learning." "A similar event," retorted the clergyman, "happened in Balaam's time. Why not allow the schoolboy to erase from his list of studies all subjects that appeared to him useless? Would he not erase everything which taxed his pleasure and freedom? Would he not obey the call of his blood, rather than the advice of his teacher? Ignorant men who have made money tell him that the study of geography is useless. His tea will come over the sea to him whether he knows where China is or not. What difference does it make whether verbs agree with their subjects or not? Why waste time learning geometry or algebra? Who keeps accounts by these? Learning spoils a man for business, they tell him. They begrudge the time and money spent in education. They want cheap and rapid transit through college for their children. Veneer will answer every practical purpose for them, instead of solid mahogany, or even paint and pine will do. It is said that the editors of the Dictionary of American Biography, who diligently searched the records of living and dead Americans, found 15,142 names worthy of a place in their 6 volumes of Annals of Successful Men, and 5,326, or more than one third of them, were college educated men. 1 in 40 of the college-educated attain a success worthy of mention, and but 1 in 10,000 of those not so educated, so that the college-bred man had 250 times the chances for success that the others had. Medical records, it is said, show that but 5% of the practicing physicians of the United States are college graduates, and yet 46% of the physicians who become locally famous enough to be mentioned by those editors come from that small 5% of college-educated persons. Less than 4% of the lawyers were college-bred, yet they furnish more than one half of all who became successful. Not 1% of the business men of the country were college educated, yet that small fraction of college bred men had 17 times the chances of success that their fellow men of business had. In brief, the college educated lawyer has 50% more chances for success than those not so favored. The college educated physician 46% more. The author 37% more. The statesman 33%, the clergyman 58%, the educator 61%, the scientist 63%. You should therefore get the best and most complete education that it is possible for you to obtain. Knowledge, then, is one of the secret keys which unlock the hidden mysteries of a successful life. I do not remember, said Beecher, a book in all the depths of learning, nor a scrap in literature, nor a work in all the schools of art, from which its author has derived a permanent renown, that is not known to have been long and patiently elaborated. You are a fool to stick so close to your work all the time, said one of Vanderbilt's young friends. We are having our fun while we are young, for when will we if we not now? Cornelius was either earning more money by working overtime, or saving what he had earned, or at home asleep, recruiting for the next day's labor and preparing for a large harvest later. Like all successful men, he made finance a study. When he entered the railroad business, it was estimated that his fortune was $35 or $40 million. The spruce young spark, says Caesar, who thinks chiefly of his mustache and boots and shiny hat, of getting along nicely and easily during the day, and talking about the theatre, the opera, or a fast horse, ridiculing the faithful young fellow who came to learn the business and make a man of himself, because he will not join in wasting his time in dissipation, will see the day. If his useless life is not earlier blasted by vicious indulgences, when he will be glad to accept a situation from his fellow clerk, whom he now ridicules and affects to despise, when the latter shall stand in the firm, dispensing benefits and acquiring fortune. When a man has done his work, says Ruskin, and nothing can anyway be materially altered in his fate, let him forget his toil and jest with his fate if he will. But what excuse can you find for wilfulness of thought at the very time when every crisis of fortune hangs on decisions? A youth thoughtless, when all the happiness of his home forever depends on the chances or the passions of the hour. A youth thoughtless, when the career of all his days depends on the opportunity of a moment. A youth thoughtless, when his every action is a foundation stone of future conduct, and every imagination a foundation of life or death. Be thoughtless in any after years, rather than now, though, indeed, there is only one place where a man may be nobly thoughtless, his deathbed. Nothing should ever be left to be done there. "On to Berlin!" was the shout of the French army in July, 1870. But, to the astonishment of the world, the French forces were cut in two and rolled as by a tidal wave into Metz and around Sedan. Soon two French armies and the Emperor surrendered, and the German troopers paraded the streets of captured Paris. But as men thought it out, as Professor Wells tells us, they came to see that it was not France that was beaten, but only Louis Napoleon and a lot of nobles. influential only because they bore titles or were favorites. Louis Napoleon, the feeble bearer of a great name, was emperor because of that name and criminal daring. By a series of happy accidents he had gained credit in the Crimean War, and at Magenta and Solferino. But the unmasking time came in the Franco-Prussian War, as it always comes when sham, artificial toy men meet genuine self-made men. And such were the German leaders: William, strong, upright, warlike, every inch a king; Von Roon, Minister of War, a master of administrative detail; Bismarck, the mastermind of European politics; and above all, Von Moltke, Chief of Staff, who hurled armies by telegraph as he sat at his cabinet, as easily as master moves chessmen against a stupid opponent. Said Captain Bingham: "You can have no idea of the wonderful machine that the German army is, and how well it is prepared for war. A chart is made out which shows just what must be done in the case of wars with the different nations, and every officer's place in the scheme is laid out beforehand. There is a schedule of trains which will supersede all other schedules the moment war is declared, and this is so arranged that the commander of the army here could telegraph to any officer to take such a train and go to such a place at a moment's notice." When the Franco-Prussian War was declared, Von Moltke was awakened at midnight and told of the fact. He said coolly to the official who aroused him: "Go to pigeon hole No. in my safe and take a paper from it and telegraph as there directed to the different troops of the empire." He then turned over and went to sleep, and awoke at his usual hour in the morning. Everyone else in Berlin was excited about the war, but Von Moltke took his morning walk as usual, and a friend who met him said: "General, you seem to be taking it very easy. Aren't you afraid of the situation? I should think you would be busy." "Ah," replied Von Moltke, "all of my work for this time has been done long beforehand, and everything that can be done now has been done." "A rare man this Von Moltke," exclaims Professor Wells, "one who made himself ready for his opportunities beyond all men known to the modern world. Of an impoverished family he rose very slowly and by his own merit. He yielded to no temptation, vice or dishonesty, of course, nor to the greater and ever-present temptation to idleness, for he constantly worked to the limit of human endurance. He was ready for every emergency, not by accident, but because he made himself ready by painstaking labor, before the opportunity came. His favorite motto was, 'Help yourself and others will help you.' Hundreds of his age in the Prussian army were of nobler birth, thousands of greater fortune, but he made himself superior to them all by extraordinary fidelity and diligence. The greatest master of strategy the world has ever seen was 66 years at school to himself before he was ready for his task. Though born with the century and an army officer at 19, he was an old man when, in 1866, as Prussian chief of staff, he crushed Austria at Sadowa and drove her out of Germany. 4 years later the silent, modest soldier of 70, ready for the still greater opportunity, smote France, and changed the map of Europe. Glory and the field marshal's baton, after 51 years of hard work. No wonder Louis Napoleon was beaten by such men as he. All Louis Napoleons have been and always will be. Opportunity always finds out frauds. It does not make men, but shows the world what they have made of themselves. Sir Henry Havelock joined the army of India in his 28th year, and waited till he was 62 for the opportunity to show himself fitted to command and skillful to plan. During those 34 years of waiting he was busy preparing himself for that march to Lucknow, which was to make him famous as a soldier. Farragut, the Viking of our western clime, who made his mast a throne, began his naval career as a mere boy, and was 64 years old before he had an opportunity to distinguish himself. But when the great test of his life came, the reserve of half a century's preparation made him master of the situation. Alexander Hamilton said, "Men give me credit for genius. All the genius I have lies just in this. When I have a subject in hand I study it profoundly. Day and night it is before me. I explore it in all its bearings. My mind becomes pervaded with it. Then the effort which I make the people are pleased to call the fruit of genius. It is the fruit of labor and thought. The law of labor is equally binding on genius and mediocrity." "Fill up the cask! Fill up the cask!" said old Dr. Bellamy, when asked by a young clergyman for advice about the composition of sermons. "Fill up the cask, and then if you tap it anywhere you will get a good stream. But if you put it but little it will dribble, 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 and you must tap, 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 and then you get but a small stream, after all." "The merchant is in a dangerous position," says Dr. W. W. Paton, "whose means are in goods trusted out all over the country on long credits, and who in an emergency has no money in the bank upon which to withdraw. A heavy deposit, subject to a side draft, is the only position of strength. And he only is intellectually strong who has made heavy deposits in the banks of memory, and can draw upon his faculties at any time, according to the necessities of the case. They say that more life, if not more labor, was spent on the piles beneath the St. Petersburg church of St. Isaac's to get a foundation, than on all the magnificent marbles and malachite which have since been lodged in it. 50 feet of Bunker Hill Monument is underground, unseen and unappreciated by the thousands who tread about that historic shaft. The rivers of India run underground, unseen, unheard by the millions who tramp about, but are therefore lost? Ask the golden harvest waving above them if it feels the water flowing beneath. The superstructure of a lifetime cannot stand upon a foundation of a day. C. H. Parkhurst says that in manhood as much as in house building the foundation keeps asserting itself all the way from the first floor to the roof. The stones laid in the underpinning may be coarse and inelegant, but even so, each such stone perpetuates itself in silent echo clear up through the pineal. The body is in that respect like an old Stradivarius violin, the ineffable sweetness of whose music is outcome and quotation from the coarse fibre of the case upon which its strings are strung. It is a very pleasant delusion, that what we call the higher qualities and energies of a person maintain that self-centred kind of existence that enables them to discard and contemn all dependence upon what is lower and less refined than themselves. But it is a delusion that always builds in an atmosphere of fact. Climb high as we like, our ladder will still require to rest on the ground. And it is probable that the keenest intellectual intuition and the most delicate throb of passion would, if analysis could be carried so far, be discovered to have its connections with a rather material affair than we know as body. Lincoln took the postmastership for the sake of reading all the papers that came to town. He read everything he could lay his hands on: the Bible, Shakespeare, Pilgrim's Progress, Life of Washington and Life of Franklin, Life of Henry Clay, Aesop's Fables. He read them over and over again until he could almost repeat them by heart. But he never read a novel in his life. His education came from the newspapers and from his contact with men and things. After he read a book he would write out an analysis of it. What a grand sight to see this long lank backwoods student lying before the fire in a log cabin without floor or windows, after everybody else was abed, devouring books he had borrowed but could not afford to buy. I have been watching the careers of young men by thousands in this busy city of New York for over 30 years, says Dr. Keeler. And I find that chief difference between the successful and the failures lies in the single element of staying power. Permanent success is oftener won by holding on than by sudden dash, however brilliant. The easily discouraged, who are pushed back by a straw, are all the time dropping to the rear, to perish or to be carried along on the stretcher of charity. They who understand and practice Abraham Lincoln's homely maxim of pegging away have achieved the soldiest success. It is better to deserve success than to merely have it. Few deserve it who do not attain it. There is no failure in this country for those whose personal habits are good, and who follow some honest calling industriously, unselfishly, and purely. If one desires to succeed he must pay the price. Work. No matter how weak a power may be, rational use will make it stronger. No matter how awkward your movements may be, how obtuse your senses, or how crude your thought, or how unregulated your desires, you may by patient discipline acquire, slowly indeed, but with the infallible certainty, grace and freedom of action, clearness and acuteness of perception, strength and precision of thought and moderation of desire. It would go very far to destroy the absurd and pernicious association of genius and idleness, to show that the greatest poets, orators, statesmen, and historians, men of the most imposing and brilliant talents, have actually labored as hard as the makers of dictionaries and arrangers of indexes. And the most obvious reason why they have been superior to other men is that they have taken more pains. Even the great genius, Lord Bacon, left large quantities of material entitled "Sudden Thoughts set down for use." John Foster was an indefatigable worker. He used to hack, split, twist, and pull up by the roots, or practice any other severity on whatever did not please him. Chalmers was asked in London what Foster was doing. "Hard at it," he said, "at the rate of a line a week." When a young lawyer, Daniel Webster, once looked in vain through all the libraries near him, and then ordered at an expense of $50 the necessary books to obtain authorities and precedents in a case in which his client was a poor blacksmith, he won his case, but on account of the poverty of his client only charged $15, thus losing heavily on the books bought, to say nothing of his time. Years after, as he was passing through New York City, he was consulted by Aaron Burr on an important but puzzling case then pending before the Supreme Court. Webster saw in a moment that it was just like the blacksmith's case, an intricate question of title, which he had solved so thoroughly that it was to him simple as a multiplication table. Going back to the time of Charles II, he gave the law and precedents involved with such readiness and accuracy of sequence that Burr asked, in great surprise, "Mr. Webster, have you been consulted before in this case?" "Most certainly not. I never heard of your case till this evening." "Very well," said Burr, "proceed." And when he had finished, Webster received the fee that paid him liberally for all the time and trouble he had spent for his early client. What the age wants is men who have the nerve and the grit to work and wait, whether the world applaud or hiss. It wants a Bancroft who can spend 26 years on the history of the United States, a Noah Webster who can devote 36 years to a dictionary, a Gibbon who can plot for 20 years on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, a Mirabeau who can struggle on for 40 years before he has a chance to show his vast reserve destined to shake an empire, a Farragut, a Van Moult who have the persistence to work and wait for half a century for their first great opportunities, a Garfield burning his lamp 15 minutes later than a rival student in his academy, a Grant fighting on heroic silence when denounced by his brother generals and politicians everywhere, a Field's untiring perseverance, spending years and a fortune laying a cable when all the world called him a fool, a Michelangelo working 7 long years decorating the Sistine Chapel with his matchless Creation and the Last Judgment, refusing all remuneration therefor, lest his pencil might catch the taint of avarice, a Titian spending 7 years on the Last Supper, a Stevenson working 15 years on a locomotive, a Watt 20 years on a condensing engine, a Lady Franklin working incessantly for 12 long years to rescue her husband from the polar seas, a Thurlow Weed walking 2 miles through the snow with rags tied around his feet for shoes, to borrow the history of the French Revolution, and eagerly devouring it before the sap bush fire, a Milton elaborating Paradise Lost in the world he could not see, and then selling it for £15, a Thackeray struggling on cheerfully after his Vanity Fair was refused by a dozen publishers, a Balzac toiling and waiting in a lonely garret, whom neither poverty, debt, nor hunger could discourage or intimidate, not daunted by privations, not hindered by discouragement. It wants men who can work and wait. That is done soon enough, which is done well. Soon ripe, soon rotten. He that would enjoy the fruit must not gather the flower. He who is impatient to become his own master is more likely to become his own slave. Better believe yourself a dunce and work away than a genius and be idle. 1 year of trained thinking is worth more than a whole college course of mental absorption of vast series of undigested facts. Facility with which the world swallows up the ordinary college graduate who thought he was going to dazzle mankind should bid you pause and reflect. But just as certainly as man was created not to crawl on all fours in the depths of primeval forests, but to develop his mental and moral faculties, just so certainly he needs education, and only by means of it will he become what he ought to become, man in the highest sense of the word. Ignorance is not simply the negation of knowledge, it is the misdirection of the mind. One step in knowledge, says Bulwer, is one step from sin. One step from sin is one step nearer to heaven. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 8 The Conquest of Obstacles. Nature, when she adds difficulties, adds brains. Emerson. Exigencies create the necessary ability to meet and conquer them. Wendell Phillips. Many men owe the grandeur of their lives to their tremendous difficulties. Spurgeon. The rugged metal of the mine must burn before its surface shine. Byron. When a man looks through a tear in his own eye, that is a lens which opens reaches in the unknown and reveals orbs no telescope could do. Beecher. No man ever worked his way in a dead calm. John Neal. Kites rise against, not with, the wind. Then welcome each rebuff that turns earth's smoothness rough, each sting that bids nor sit nor stand, but go. Browning. What a fine profession ours would be if there were no gibbets, said one of two highwaymen who chanced to pass a gallows. Tut, tut, ye blockhead, replied the other. Gibbets are the making of us, for if there were no gibbets, everyone would be a highwayman. Just so with every art, trade, or pursuit. It is the difficulties that scare and keep out unworthy competitors. Life, says a philosopher, refuses to be so adjusted as to eliminate from it all strife and conflict and pain. There are 1,000 tasks that, in larger interests than ours, must be done, whether we want them or no. The world refuses to walk upon tiptoe so that we may be able to sleep. It gets up very early and stays up very late, and all the while there is the conflict of myriads of hammers and saws and axes with the stubborn material that in no other way can be made to serve its use and do its work for man. And then, too, these hammers and axes are not wielded without strain or pang, but swung by the millions of toilers who labor with their cries and groans and tears. Nay, our temple building, whether it be for God or man, exacts its bitter toll, and fills life with cries and blows. The thousand rivalries of our daily business, the fierce animosities when we are beaten, the even fiercer exultation when we have beaten, the crashing blows of disaster, the piercing scream of defeat, these things we have not yet gotten rid of, nor in this life ever will. Why should we wish to get rid of them? We are here, my brother, to be hewed and hammered and planed in God's quarry and on God's anvil for a nobler life to come. Only the muscle that is used is developed. "Troubles are often the tools by which God fashions us for better things," said Beecher. Far up the mountainside lies a block of granite, and says to itself, "How happy am I in my serenity! Above the winds, above the trees, almost above the flight of birds, here I rest age after age, and nothing disturbs me." Yet what is it? It is only a bare block of granite, jutting out of the cliff, and its happiness is the happiness of death. By and by comes the miner, and with strong and repeated strokes he drills a hole in its top, and the rock says, "What does this mean?" Then the black powder is poured in, and with a blast that makes the mountain echo, the block is blown asunder, and goes crashing down into the valley. "Ah!" it exclaims as it falls, "why this rending?" Then come saws to cut and fashion it, and humbled now, and willing to be nothing, it is borne away from the mountain and conveyed to the city. Now it is chiseled and polished, till at length, finished in beauty, by block and tackle it is raised, with mighty hoistings, high in the air, to be the top stone on some monument of the country's glory. It is this scantiness of means, this continual deficiency, this constant hitch, this perpetual struggle to keep the head above water and the wolf from the door, that keeps society from falling to pieces. Let every man have a few more dollars than he wants, and anarchy would follow. "Do you wish to live without a trial?" asks a modern teacher. "Then you wish to die but half a man. Without trial you cannot guess at your own strength. Men do not learn to swim on a table. They must go into deep water and buffet the waves. Hardship is the native soil of manhood and self-reliance. Trials are rough teachers, but rugged schoolmasters make rugged pupils. A man who goes through life prosperous, and comes to his grave without a wrinkle, is not half a man. Difficulties are God's errands, and when we are sent upon them, we should esteem it a proof of God's confidence. We should reach after the highest good." Suddenly, with much jarring and jolting, an electric car came to a standstill just in front of a heavy truck that was headed in an opposite direction. The huge truck wheels were sliding uselessly round on the car tracks that were wet and slippery from rain. All the urging of the teamster and the straining of the horses were in vain, until the motorman quietly tossed a shovelful of sand on the track under the heavy wheels, and then the truck lumbered on its way. "Friction is a very good thing," remarked a passenger. There is a beautiful tale of Scandinavian mythology. A hero, under the promise of becoming a demigod, is bidden in the celestial halls to perform 3 test acts of prowess. He is to drain the drinking horn of Thor. Then he must run a race with a courser so fleet that he fairly spurns the ground under his flying footsteps. Then he must wrestle with a toothless old woman, whose sinewy hands, as wiry as eagle claws in the grapple, make his very flesh to quiver. He is victorious in them all. But as the crown of success is placed upon his temples, he discovers for the first time that he has had for his antagonist the three greatest forces of nature. He raced with thought, he wrestled with old age, he drank the sea. Nature, like the God of nature, wrestles with us as a friend, not an enemy, wanting us to gain the victory, and wrestles with us that we may understand and enjoy her best blessings. Every greatest and highest earthly good has come to us unfolded and enriched by this terrible wrestling with nature. A curious society still exists in Paris, composed of dramatic authors who meet once a month and dine together. Their number has no fixed limit, only every member to be eligible must have been hissed. An eminent dramatist is selected for chairman and holds the post for 3 months. His election generally follows close upon a splendid failure. Some of the world-famous ones have enjoyed this honor. Dumas Jr., Zola, and Offenbach have all filled this chair and presided at the monthly dinner. These dinners are given on the last Friday of the month and are said to be extraordinarily hilarious. "I do believe God wanted a grand poem of that man," said George MacDonald of Milton, "and so blinded him that he might be able to write it." "Returned with thanks," has made many an author. Failure often leads a man to success by arousing his latent energy, by firing a dormant purpose, by awakening powers which were sleeping. Men of metal turn disappointments into helps, as the oyster turns into pearls the sand which annoys it. Let the adverse breath of criticism be to you only what the blast of the storm wind is to the eagle, a force against him that lifts him higher. "I do not see," says Emerson, "how any man can afford, for the sake of his nerves and his nap, to spare any action in which he can partake. It is pearls and rubies to his discourse. Drudgery, calamity, exasperation, want are instructors in eloquence and wisdom. The true scholar grudges every opportunity of action passed by as a loss of power." "Adversity is a severe instructor," says Edmund Burke, "set over us by one who knows us better than we do ourselves, as he loves us better too. He that wrestles with us strengthens our nerves and sharpens our skill. Our antagonist is our helper. This conflict with difficulty makes us acquainted with our object, and compels us to consider it in all its relations. It will not suffer us to be superficial." Strong characters, like the palm tree, seem to thrive best when most abused. Men who have stood up bravely under great misfortune for years are often unable to bear prosperity. Their good fortune takes the spring out of their energy, as the torrid zone enervates races accustomed to a vigorous climate. Some people never come to themselves until baffled, rebuffed, thwarted, defeated, crushed in the opinion of those around them. Trials unlock their virtues. Defeat is the threshold of their victory. Every man who makes a fortune has been more than once a bankrupt, if the truth were known, says Albion Tourget. Grant's failure as a subaltern made him commander-in-chief, and for myself, my failure to accomplish what I set out to do led me to what I never had aspired to. "What is defeat?" asked Wendell Phillips. "Nothing but education." And a life's disaster may become the landmark from which there has begun a new era, a broader life for man. "To make his way at the bar," said an eminent jurist, "a young man must live like a hermit and work like a horse. There is nothing that does a young lawyer so much good as to be half starved." we are the victors of our opponents. They have developed in us the very power by which we overcome them. Without their opposition, we could never have braced and anchored and fortified ourselves, as the oak is braced and anchored for its 1,000 battles with the tempests. Our trials, our sorrows, and our griefs develop us in a similar way. Obstacles, says Mitchell, are great incentives. I lived for whole years upon Virgil, and found myself well off. Poverty, Horace tells us, drove him to poetry. Nothing more unmans a man than to take away from him the spur of necessity, which urges him onward and upward to the goal of his ambition. Man is naturally lazy, and wealth induces indolence. The great object of life is development, the unfolding and drawing out of our powers, and whatever tempts us to a life of indolence or inaction, or to seek pleasure merely, whatever furnishes us a crutch when we can develop our muscles better by walking, all helps, guides, props, whatever tempts a life of inaction, in whatever guise it may come, is a curse. I always pity the boy or girl with inherited wealth, for the temptation to hide their talents in a napkin, undeveloped, is very, very great. It is not natural for them to walk when they can ride, to go alone when they can be helped. Quentin Matsys was a blacksmith at Antwerp. When in his 20th year, he wished to marry the daughter of a painter. The father refused his consent. "Wert thou a painter," said he, "she should be thine, but a blacksmith, never." "I will be a painter," said the young man. He applied his new art with so much perseverance that in a short time he produced pictures which gave a promise of the highest excellence. He gained for his reward the fair hand for which he sighed, and rose ere long to a high rank in his profession. Take 2 acorns from the same tree, as nearly alike as possible. Plant one on a hill by itself, and the other in a dense forest, and watch them grow. The oak standing alone is exposed to every storm. Its roots reach out in every direction, clutching the rocks and piercing deep into the earth. Every rootlet lends itself to steady the growing giant, as if in anticipation of fierce conflict with the elements. Sometimes its upward growth seems checked for years, but all the while it has been expending its energy in pushing a root against a large rock to gain a firmer anchorage. Then it shoots proudly aloft again, prepared to defy the hurricane. The gales which sport so rudely with its wide branches find more than their match, and only serve still further to toughen the very minutest fiber from pith to bark. The acorn planted in the deep forest shoots up a weak, slender sapling. Shielded by its neighbors, it feels no need of spreading its roots far and wide for support. Take 2 boys, as nearly alike as possible. Place one in the country away from the hothouse culture and refinements of the city, with only the district school, the Sunday school, and a few books. Remove wealth and props of every kind, and if he has the right kind of material in him, he will thrive. Every obstacle overcome lends him strength for the next conflict. If he falls, he rises with more determination than before. Like a rubber ball, the harder the obstacle he meets, the higher he rebounds. Obstacles and opposition are but apparatus of the gymnasium in which the fibers of his manhood are developed. He compels respect and recognition from those who have ridiculed his poverty. Put the other boy in a Vanderbilt family. Give him French and German nurses. Gratify every wish. Place him under the tutelage of great masters and send him to Harvard. Give him thousands a year for spending money, and let him travel extensively. The two meet. The city lad is ashamed of his country brother. The plain, threadbare clothes, hard hands, tawny face, and awkward manner of the country boy make sorry contrast with the genteel appearance of the other. The poor boy bemoans his hard lot, regrets that he has, quote, "no chance in life," unquote, and envies the city youth. He thinks that it is a cruel providence that places such a wide gulf between them. They meet again as men, but how changed! It is as easy to distinguish the sturdy, self-made man from the one who has been propped up all his life by wealth, position, and family influence, as it is for the shipbuilder to tell the difference between the plank from the rugged mountain oak and one from the sapling of the forest. If you think there is no difference, place each plank in the bottom of a ship and test them in a hurricane at sea. The athlete does not carry the gymnasium away with him, but he carries the skill and muscle which gave him his reputation. The lessons you learn at school will give you strength and skill in after life, and power just in proportion to the accuracy, the clearness of perception with which you learn your lessons. The school was your gymnasium. You do not carry away the Greek and Latin textbooks, the geometry and algebra into your occupations any more than the athlete carries the apparatus of the gymnasium. But you carry away the skill and the power if you have been painstaking, accurate, and faithful. It is in me, and it shall come out. And it did. For Richard Brinsley Sheridan became the most brilliant, eloquent, and amazing statesman of his day. Yet if his first efforts had been but moderately successful, he might have been content with mere mediocrity. It was his defeats that nerved him to strive for eminence and win it. But it took hard, persistent work in his case to secure it, just as it did in that of so many others. Byron was stung into a determination to go to the top by a scathing criticism of his first book, Hours of Idleness, published when he was but 19 years of age. Macaulay said, "There is scarce an instance in history of so sudden a rise to so dizzy an eminence as Byron reached." In a few years he stood by the side of such men as Scott, Southey, and Campbell. Many an orator like Stuttering Jack Curran, or Orator Mum, as he was once called, has been spurred into eloquence by ridicule and abuse. Where the sky is gray and the climate unkindly, where the soil yields nothing save to the diligent hand, and life itself cannot be supported without incessant toil, man has reached his highest range of physical and intellectual development. The most beautiful and the strongest animals, as a rule, have come from the same narrow belt of latitude which has produced the heroes of the world. The most beautiful, as well as the strongest characters, are not developed in warm climates, where a man finds his bread ready-made on trees, and where exertion is a great effort, but rather in a trying climate and on a stubborn soil. It is no chance that returns to the Hindu ryot a penny, and to the American laborer $1, for his daily toil, that makes Mexico with her mineral wealth poor, and New England with its granite and ice rich. It is rugged necessity, it is the struggle to obtain, it is poverty, the priceless spur, that develops the stamina of manhood, and calls the race out of barbarism. Labor found the world a wilderness, and has made it a garden. The law of adaptation by which conditions affect an organism is simple and well known. It is that which calluses the palm of the oarsman, strengthens the waist of the wrestler, fits the back to its burden. It inexorably compels the organism to adapt itself to its conditions, to like them, and so to survive them. As soon as young eagles can fly, the old birds tumble them out, and tear the down and feathers from their nest. The rude and rough experience of the eaglet fits him to become the bold king of birds, fierce and expert in pursuing his prey. Benjamin Franklin ran away, and George Law was turned out of doors. Thrown upon their own resources, they early acquired the energy and skill to overcome difficulties. Boys who are bound out, crowded out, kicked out, usually turn out, while those who do not have these disadvantages frequently fail to come out. From an aimless, idle, and useless brain, emergencies often call out powers and virtues before unknown and unsuspected. How often we see a young man develop astounding ability and energy after the death of a parent or the loss of a fortune, or after some other calamity has knocked the props and crutches from under him. The prison has roused the slumbering fire in many a noble mind. Robinson Crusoe was written in prison. The Pilgrim's Progress appeared in Bedford jail. The Life and Times of Baxter, Eliot's Monarchia of Man, and Penn's No Cross, No Crown were written by prisoners. Sir Walter Raleigh wrote the history of the world during his imprisonment of 13 years. Luther translated the Bible while confined in the castle of Wartburg. For 20 years Dante worked in exile, and even under sentence of death. His works were burned in public after his death, but genius will not burn. Adversity exasperates fools, dejects cowards, draws out the faculties of the wise and industrious, puts the modest to the necessity of trying their skill, awes the opulent, and makes the idle industrious. Neither do uninterrupted success and prosperity qualify men for usefulness and happiness. The storms of adversity, like those of the ocean, rouse the faculties, and excite the invention, prudence, skill, and fortitude of the voyager. The martyrs of ancient times, in bracing their minds to outward calamities, acquired a loftiness of purpose and a moral heroism worth a lifetime of softness and security. A man upon whom continuous sunshine falls is like the earth in August. He becomes parched and dry and hard and close-grained. Men have drawn from adversity the elements of greatness. If you have the blues, go and see the poorest and sickest families within your knowledge. The darker the setting, the brighter the diamond. Don't run about and tell acquaintances that you have been unfortunate. People do not like to have unfortunate men for acquaintances. This is the crutch age. Helps and aids are advertised everywhere. We have institutes, colleges, universities, teachers, books, libraries, newspapers, magazines. Our thinking is done for us. Our problems are all worked out in explanations and keys. Our boys are too often tutored through college with very little study. Short roads and abridged methods are characteristic of the century. Ingenious methods are used everywhere to get the drudgery out of the college course. Newspapers give us our politics, and preachers our religion. Self-help and self-reliance are getting old-fashioned. Nature, as if conscious of delayed blessings, has rushed to man's relief with her wondrous forces, and undertakes to do the world's drudgery and emancipate him from Eden's curse. End of chapter 8. Recording by David Martin.
Chapter 9 of How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 9. Dead in Earnest. It is the live coal that kindles others, not the dead. What made Demosthenes the greatest of all orators was that he appeared the most entirely possessed by the feelings he wished to inspire. The effect produced by Charles Fox, who, by exaggerations of party spirit, was often compared to Demosthenes, seems to have arisen wholly from this earnestness, which made up for want of almost every grace, both of manner and style. Anonymous. 12 poor men taken out of boats and creeks, without any help of learning, should conquer the world to the cross. Stephen Carnock. For his heart was in his work, and the heart giveth grace unto every art. Longfellow. He did it with all his heart, and prospered. 2 Chronicles. The only conclusive evidence of a man's sincerity is that he gives himself for a principle. Words, money, all things else are comparatively easy to give away. But when a man makes a gift of his daily life and practice, it is plain that the truth, whatever it may be, has taken possession of him. Lowell. The emotions, says Whipple, may all be included in the single word enthusiasm, or that impulsive force which liberates the mental power from the ice of timidity, as spring loosens the streams from the grasp of winter, and sends them forth in a rejoicing rush. The mind of youth, when impelled by this original strength and enthusiasm of nature, is keen, eager, inquisitive, intense, audacious, rapidly assimilating facts into faculties, and knowledge into power, and, above all, teeming with that joyous fullness of creative life which radiates thoughts as inspiration, and magnetizes as well as informs. Columbus, my hero, exclaims Carlyle, royalist seeking of all! It is no friendly environment this of thine, in the waste deep waters. Around thee, mutinous discouraged souls; behind thee, disgrace and ruin; before thee, the unpenetrated veil of night. Brother, these wild water mountains, bounding from their deep bases, 10 miles deep, I am told, are not there on thy behalf. Meseems they have other work than floating thee forward, and the huge winds that sweep from Ursa Major to the tropics and equator, dancing their giant waltz through the kingdoms of chaos and immensity, they care little about filling rightly or filling wrongly the small shoulder of mutton sails in this cockle skiff of thine. Thou art not among articulate speaking friends, my brother, thou art among immeasurable dumb monsters, tumbling, howling wide as the world here. Secret, far off, invisible to all hearts but thine, there lies a help in them. See how thou wilt get at that. Patiently thou wilt wait till the mad sou'wester spend itself, saving thyself by dexterous science of defence the while. Valiantly, with swift decision, thou wilt strike in where the favouring east wind, the possible, springs up. Mutiny of men thou wilt sternly repress. Weakness, despondency, thou wilt cheerily encourage. Thou wilt swallow down complaint, unreason, weariness, weakness of others and thyself. How much wilt thou swallow down? And there shall be a depth of silence in thee, deeper than this sea, which is but 10 miles deep. A silence unsoundable, known to God only. Thou shalt be a great man. Yes, my world soldier, thou of the world marine service, thou wilt have to be greater than this tumultuous unmeasured world here round thee is. Thou, in thy strong soul, as with a wrestler's arms, shall embrace it, harness it down, and make it bear thee on, to new Americas, or whither God wills. With what concentration of purpose did Washington put the whole weight of his character into the scales of our cause in the Revolution? With what earnest singleness of aim did Lincoln, in the cabinet, Grant, in the field, throw his whole soul into the contest of our Civil War! The power of Philip's Brook, at which men wondered, lay in his tremendous earnestness. No matter what your work is, says Emerson, let it be yours. No matter if you are a tinker or preacher, blacksmith or president, let what you are doing be organic. Let it be in your bones, and you open the door by which the affluence of heaven and earth shall stream into you. Again, he says, God will not have his works made manifest by cowards. A man is relieved and gay when he has put his heart into his work and done his best. But what he has said or done otherwise shall give him no peace. It is a deliverance which does not deliver. In the attempt, his genius deserts him, no muse befriends, no invention, no hope. I do not know how it is with others when speaking on an important question, said Henry Clay, but on such occasions I seem to be unconscious of the external world. Wholly engrossed by the subject before me, I lose all sense of personal identity, of time, or of surrounding objects. I have been so busy for 20 years trying to save the souls of other people, said Livingstone, that I had forgotten that I had one of my own until a savage auditor asked me if I felt the influence of the religion I was advocating. Well, I've worked hard enough for it, said Malibran when a critic expressed his admiration of her D in alt, reached by running up 3 octaves from low D. I've been chasing it for a month. I pursued it everywhere, when I was dressing, when I was doing my hair, and at last I found it on the toe of a shoe that I was putting on. People smile at the enthusiasm of youth, said Charles Kingsley, that enthusiasm which they secretly look back at with a sigh, perhaps unconscious that it is partly their own fault that they ever lost it. Should I die this minute, said Nelson at an important crisis, want of frigates would be found written on my heart. Said Dr. Arnold, the celebrated instructor, I feel more and more the need of intercourse with men who take life in earnest. It is painful to me to be always on the surface of things. Not that I wish for much of what is called religious conversation. That is often apt to be on the surface. But I want a sign which one catches by a sort of masonry, that a man knows what he is about in life. When I find this, it opens my heart with as fresh a sympathy as when I was 20 years younger. Archimedes, the greatest geometer of antiquity, was consulted by the king in regard to a gold crown suspected of being fraudulently alloyed with silver. While considering the best method of detecting any fraud, he plunged into a full bathing tub, and, with the thought that the water that overflowed must be equal in weight to his body, he discovered the method of obtaining the bulk of the crown compared with an equally heavy mass of pure gold. Excited by the discovery, he ran through the streets undressed, crying, I have found it! Equally celebrated is his remark, Give me where to stand, and I will move the world. His only remark to the Roman soldier who entered his room while engaged in geometrical study was, Don't step on my circle. Refusing to follow the soldier to Marcellus, who had captured the city, he was killed on the spot. He is said to have remarked, My head, but not my circle. Every great and commanding moment in the annals of the world, says Emerson, is the triumph of some enthusiasm. The victories of the Arabs after Mahomet, who in a few years, from a small and mean beginning, established a larger empire than that of Rome, is an example. They did they knew not what. The naked Derar, horsed on an idea, was found an overmatch for a troop of cavalry. The women fought like men, and conquered the Roman men. They were miserably equipped, miserably fed. They were temperance troops. There was neither brandy nor flesh needed to feed them. They conquered Asia and Africa and Spain on barley. Caliph Omar's walking stick struck more terror into those who saw it than another man's sword. Horace Vernet's enthusiasm and devotion to one idea of his life knew no bounds. He had himself lashed to the mast in a terrible gale on the Mediterranean, when all others on board were seized with terror, and with great delight sketched the towering waves which threatened every minute to swallow the vessel. Several writers tell the story that a great artist, Giotto, about to paint the Crucifixion, induced a poor man to let him bind him upon a cross, in order that he might get a better idea of the terrible scene that he was about to put upon the canvas. He promised faithfully that he would release his model in an hour, but, to the latter's horror, The painter seized a dagger and plunged it into his heart, and while the blood was streaming from the ghastly wound, painted his death agony. Beecher was a very dull boy, and the last member of the family of whom anything was expected. He had a weak memory and disliked study. He shunned society and wanted to go to sea. Even when he went to college, many of his classmates stood ahead of him who have fallen into oblivion. But when he was converted, his whole life changed. He was full of enthusiasm, hopefulness, and zeal. Nothing was too menial for him to undertake to carry his purpose. He chopped wood, built the fire in his little church in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, of only 18 members, cleaned the lamps, swept the floor, and washed the windows. He built the fire, baked, washed when his wife was ill. The pent-up enthusiasm of his ambitious life burst the barriers of his inhospitable surroundings until he blossomed out into America's greatest pulpit orator. When Handel was a little boy, he bought a clavichord, hid it in the attic, and went there at night to play upon it, muffling the strings with small pieces of fine woolen cloth, so that the sound should not waken the family. Michelangelo neglected school to copy drawings which he dared not carry home. Murillo filled the margin of his schoolbook with drawings. Dryden read Polybius before he was 10 years old. Lebrun, when a boy, drew with a piece of charcoal on the walls of the house. Pope wrote excellent verses at 14. Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician, composed at 16 a tract on the conic sections. Professor Agassiz was so enthusiastic in his work, and so loved the fishes, the fowl, and the cattle, that it is said these creatures would die for him to give them their skeletons. His father wanted him to fit for commercial life, but the fish haunted him day and night. Confucius said that he was so eager in the pursuit of knowledge that he forgot his food, and that in the joys of its attainment he forgot his sorrows, and that he did not even perceive that old age was coming on. "The boy that tries to make himself useful," said an employer of the errand boy, George W. Childs. "It is this trying to be useful and helpful that promotes us in life." Once when Mr. Harvey, an accomplished mathematician, was in a bookseller's shop, he saw a poor lad of mean appearance enter and write something on a slip of paper and give it to the proprietor. On inquiry, he found this was a poor deaf boy, Kitto, who afterwards became one of the most noted biblical scholars in the world, and who wrote his first book in the poorhouse. He had come to borrow a book. When a lad, he had fallen backwards from a ladder 35 feet upon the pavement, with a load of slates he was carrying to the roof. The poor lad was so thirsty for books that he would borrow from booksellers who would loan them to him out of pity, read them, and return them. The Youth's Companion says that Mr. Edison, in his new biography, his Life and Inventions, describes the accidental method by which he discovered the principle of the phonograph. There is a kind of accident that happens only to a certain kind of man. "I was singing to the mouthpiece of a telephone," Mr. Edison says, "when the vibrations of the voice sent the fine steel point into my finger. That set me to thinking. If I could record the actions of the point, and send the point over the same surface afterward, I saw no reason why the thing would not talk. I tried the experiment first on a slip of telegraph paper, and found that the point made an alphabet. I shouted the words 'Halloo! Halloo!' into the mouthpiece, ran the paper back over the steel point, and heard a faint 'Halloo! Halloo!' in return. I determined to make a machine that would work accurately, and gave my assistants instructions, telling them what I had discovered. They laughed at me. That's the whole story. The phonograph is the result of the pricking of a finger. It is one thing to hit upon an idea, however, and another thing to carry it out to perfection. The machine would talk, but like many young children, it had difficulty with certain sounds, in the present case with aspirants and sibilants. Mr. Edison's biographers say, but the statement is somewhat exaggerated, he has frequently spent from 15 to 20 hours daily, for 6 or 7 months on a stretch, dinning the word Spezia, for example, into the stubborn surface of the wax. "Spezia!" roared the inventor. "Petzia!" lisped the phonograph in tones of ladylike reserve, and so on through the thousands of graded repetitions till the desired results were obtained. The primary education of the phonograph was comical in the extreme. To hear those grave and reverend signors, rich in scientific honours, patiently reiterating, "Mary had a little lamb, lamb, lamb." and elaborating that point with anxious gravity was to receive a practical demonstration of the eternal unfitness of things. Milton, when blind, old, and poor, showed a royal cheerfulness, and never bated one jot of heart or hope, but steered right onward. Dickens's characters seemed to possess him, and haunt him day and night until properly portrayed in his stories. At a time when it was considered dangerous to society in Europe for the common people to read books and listen to lectures on any but religious subjects, Charles Knight determined to enlighten the masses by cheap literature. He believed that a paper could be instructive and not be dull, cheap without being wicked. He started the Penny Magazine, which acquired a circulation of 200,000 the first year. Knight projected the Penny Cyclopedia, the library of entertaining knowledge, half-hours with the best authors, and other useful books at a low price. His whole adult life was spent in the work of elevating the common people by cheap yet wholesome publications. He died in poverty, but grateful people have erected a noble monument over his ashes. Demosthenes roused the torpid spirits of his countrymen to a vigorous effort to preserve their independence against the designs of an ambitious and artful prince, and Philip had just reason to say he was more afraid of that man than of all the fleets and armies of the Athenians. Horace Greeley was a hampered genius who never had a chance to show himself until he started the Tribune, into which he poured his whole individuality, life, and soul. Emerson lost the first years of his life trying to be someone else. He finally came to himself and said, "If a single man plant himself indomitably on his instincts, and there abide, the whole world will come round to him in the end. Though we travel the world over to find the beautiful, we must carry it with us, or we find it not. The man that stands by himself, the universe stands by him also." Take Michelangelo's course, to confide in oneself and be something of worth and value. None of us will ever accomplish anything excellent or commanding, except when he listens to this whisper, which is heard by him alone. Many unknown writers would make fame and fortune if, like Bunyan and Milton and Dickens and George Eliot and Scott and Emerson, they would write down their own lives in their manuscripts, if they would write about things they have seen, that they have felt, that they have known. It is the life thoughts that stir and convince, that move and persuade, that carry their very iron particles into the blood. The real heaven has never been outdone by the ideal. Neither poverty nor misfortune could keep Linnaeus from his botany. The English and Austrian armies called Napoleon the 100,000 man. His presence was considered equal to that force in battle. The lesson he teaches is that which vigour always teaches, that there is always room for it. To what heap of cowardly doubts is not that man's life an answer? End of Chapter 9. Dead in Earnest. Recording by Lucas Balding.
Chapter 10 of How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Franklin Canfield. How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 10. To be great, concentrate. Let everyone ascertain his special business and calling, and stick to it. Franklin. He who follows two hares is sure to catch neither. None sends his arrow to the mark in view, whose hand is feeble or his aim untrue. Cowper. He who wishes to fulfill his mission must be a man of one idea, that is, of one great overmastering purpose, overshadowing all of his aims and guiding and controlling his entire life. Bate. The shortest way to do anything is to do only one thing at a time. Cecil. The power of concentration is one of the most valuable of intellectual attainments. Horace Mann. The power of a man increases steadily by continuance in one direction. Emerson. Careful attention to one thing often proves superior to genius and art. Cicero. It puffed like a locomotive, said a boy of the donkey engine. It whistled like the steam cars, but it didn't go anywhere. The world is full of donkey engines, of people who can whistle and puff and pull, but they don't go anywhere. They have no definite aim, no controlling purpose. The great secret of Napoleon's power lay in his marvelous ability to concentrate his forces upon a single point. After finding the weak place in the enemy's ranks, he would mass his men and hurl them upon the enemy like an avalanche until he made a breach. What a lesson of the power of concentration there is in that man's life! He was such a master of himself that he could concentrate his powers upon the smallest detail as well as upon an empire. When Napoleon had anything to say, he always went straight to his mark. He had a purpose in everything he did. There was no dilly-dallying nor shilly-shallying. He knew what he wanted to say and said it. It was the same with all of his plans. What he wanted to do, he did. He always hit the bullseye. His great success in war was due largely to his definiteness of aim. He knew what he wanted to do and did it. He was like a great burning glass, concentrating the rays of the sun upon a single spot. He burned a hole wherever he went. The sun's rays scattered do no execution, but concentrated in a burning glass, they melt solid granite. Yes, a diamond even. There are plenty of men who have ability enough. The rays of their faculties taken separately are all right, but they are powerless to collect them, to concentrate them upon a single object. They lack the burning glass of a purpose to focalize upon one spot the separate rays of their ability. Versatile men, universal geniuses, are usually weak because they have no power to concentrate the rays of their ability, to focalize them upon one point until they burn a hole in whatever they undertake. This power to bring all of one's scattered forces into one focal point makes all the difference between success and failure. The sun might blaze out upon the earth forever without burning a hole in it or setting anything on fire, whereas a very few of these rays, concentrated in a burning glass, would, as stated, transform a diamond into vapor. Sir James Mackintosh was a man of marvelous ability. He excited in everybody who knew him great expectations, but there was no purpose in his life to act as a burning glass to collect the brilliant rays of his intellect, by which he might have dazzled the world. Most men have ability enough, if they could only focalize it into one grand, central, all-absorbing purpose to accomplish great things. To encourage me in my efforts to cultivate the power of attention, said a friend of John C. Calhoun, he stated that to his end he had early subjected his mind to such a rigid course of discipline, and had persisted without faltering until he had acquired a perfect control over it, that he could now confine it to any subject as long as he pleased, without wandering even for a moment, that it was his uniform habit, when he set out alone to walk or ride, to select a subject for reflection, and that he never suffered his attention to wander from it until he was satisfied with its examination. "My friend laughs at me because I have but one idea," said a learned American chemist, "but I have learned that if I wish ever to make a breach in a wall, I must play my guns continually upon one point." "It is his will that has made him what he is," said an intimate friend of Philip D. Armour, the Chicago millionaire. "He fixes his eye on something ahead, and no matter what rises upon the right or the left, he never sees it. He goes straight in pursuit of the object ahead and overtakes it at last. He never gives up what he undertakes." While Horace Greeley would devote a column of the New York Tribune to an article, Thurlow Weed would treat the same subject in a few words in the Albany Evening Journal, and put the argument into such shape as to carry far more conviction. "If you would be pungent," says Southey, "be brief, for it is with words as with sunbeams. The more they are condensed, the deeper they burn." "The only valuable kind of study," said Sydney Smith, "is to read so heartily that dinner time comes 2 hours before you expected it. To sit with your Livy before you and hear the geese cackling that saved the Capitol, and to see with your own eyes the Carthaginian settlers gathering up the rings of the Roman knights after the battle of Cannae, and heaping them into bushels, and to be so intimately present at the actions you are reading of, that when anybody knocks at the door it will take you 2 or 3 seconds to determine whether you are in your own study or on the plains of Lombardy, looking at Hannibal's weather-beaten face and admiring the splendor of his single eye." "Never study on speculation," says Waters. "All such study is vain. Form a plan, have an object, then work for it. Learn all you can about it, and you will be sure to succeed." What I mean by studying on speculation is that aimless learning of things because they may be useful some day, which is like the conduct of the woman who bought at auction a brass door-plate with the name of Thompson on it, thinking it might be useful some day. "I resolved when I began to read law," said Edward Sugden, afterward Lord St. Leonard, "to make everything I acquired perfectly my own, and never go on to a second reading till I had entirely accomplished the first. Many of the competitors read as much in a day as I did in a week, but at the end of 12 months my knowledge was as fresh as on the day it was acquired, while theirs had glided away from their recollection." Very often, says Sydney Smith, the modern precept of education is, "Be ignorant of nothing." But my advice is, have the courage to be ignorant of a great number of things, so that you may avoid the calamity of being ignorant of all things. Lord, help me to take fewer things into my hands, and to do them well, is a prayer recommended by Paxton Hood to an overworked man. "Many persons, seeing me so much engaged in active life," said Edward Bulwer Lytton, "and as much about the world as if I had never been a student, have said to me, 'When do you get time to write all of your books? How on earth do you contrive to do so much work?' I shall surprise you by the answer I made. The answer is this: I contrive to do so much work by never doing too much at a time. A man to get through work well must not overwork himself, or if he do too much today, the reaction of fatigue will come, and he will be obliged to do little tomorrow. Now, since I began really and earnestly to study, which was not till I had left college, and was actually in the world, I may perhaps say that I have gone through as large a course of general reading as most men of my time. I have traveled much, and I have seen much. I have mixed much in politics, and in the various businesses of life. And, in addition to all of this, I have published somewhere about 60 volumes, some upon subjects requiring much special research. And what time do you think, as a general rule, I have devoted to study, to reading, and writing? Not more than 3 hours a day. And when Parliament is sitting, not always that. But then, during these 3 hours, I have given my whole attention to what I was about. The things that are crowded out of a life are the test of that life. Not what we would like, but what we long for and strive for with all our might we attain. One great cause of failure of young men in business, says Carnegie, is lack of concentration. They are prone to seek outside investments. The cause of many a surprising failure lies in so doing. Every dollar of capital and credit, every business thought, should be concentrated upon the one business upon which a man has embarked. He should never scatter his shot. It is a poor business which would not yield better returns for increased capital than any outside investment. No man or set of men or corporation can manage a businessman's capital as well as he can manage it himself. The rule, "Do not put all your eggs in one basket," does not apply to a man's life work. Put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket, is the true doctrine, the most valuable rule of all. "A man must not only desire to be right," said Beecher, "he must be right. You may say, 'I wish to send this ball so as to kill the lion crouching yonder, ready to spring upon me.' My wishes are all right, and I hope Providence will direct the ball. Providence won't. You must do it, and if you do not, you are a dead man. The ruling idea of Milton's life and the key to his mental history is his resolve to produce a great poem. Not that the aspiration in itself is singular, for it is probably shared in by every poet in his turn. As every clever schoolboy is destined by himself or his friends to become Lord Chancellor, and every private in the French army carries in his haversack the baton of a marshal, so it is a necessary ingredient of the dream of Parnassus that it should embody itself in a form of surpassing brilliance. What distinguishes Milton from the crowd of youthful literary aspirants, audiobook, is his consistency of resolve. He not only nourished through manhood the dream of youth, keeping under the importunate instincts which carry off most ambitions in middle life into the pursuit of place, profit, honor, the thorns which spring up and smother the wheat, but carried out his dream in its integrity in old age. He formed himself for this achievement and no other. Study at home, travel abroad, the arena of political controversy, the public service, the practice of the domestic virtues were so many parts of the schooling which was to make a poet. Bismarck adopted it as the aim of his public life, to snatch Germany from the Austrian oppression, and to gather round Prussia in a North German confederation all the states whose tone of thought, religion, manners, and interest were in harmony with those of Prussia. To attain this end, he once said in conversation, I would brave all dangers, exile, the scaffold itself. What matter if they hang me, provided the rope with which I am hung binds this new Germany firmly to the Prussian throne. It is related of Greeley that when he was writing his American Conflict, he found it necessary to conceal himself somewhere to prevent constant interruptions. He accordingly took a room in the Bible house, where he worked from 10 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon, and then appeared in the sanctum, seemingly as fresh as ever. Cooper Institute is the evening school which Peter Cooper, as long ago as 1810, resolved to found some day, when he was looking about as an apprentice for a place where he could go to school evenings. Through all his career in various branches of business, he never lost sight of this object, and as his wealth increased, he was pleased that it brought nearer the realization of his dream. See a great lawyer like Rufus Choate, says Dr. Storrs, in a case where his convictions are strong and his feelings are enlisted. He saw long ago, as he glanced over the box, that 5 of those in it were sympathetic with him. As he went on, he became equally certain of 7. The number now has risen to 10, but 2 are still left whom he feels that he has not persuaded or mastered. Upon them he now concentrates his power, summing up the facts, setting forth anew and more forcibly the principles, urging upon them his view of the case with a more and more intense action of his mind upon theirs, until one only is left, like the blow of a hammer, continually repeated until the iron bar crumbles beneath it. His whole force comes with ceaseless percussion on that one mind till it has yielded, and accepts the conviction on which the pleader's purpose is fixed. Men say afterward, he surpassed himself. It was only because the singleness of his aim gave unity, intensity, and overpowering energy to the mind. The foreman of the jury, however, said Whipple, was a hard-hearted, practical man, a model of business intellect and integrity, but with an incapacity of understanding any intellect or conscience radically differing from his own. Mr. Choate's argument, as far as the facts in the law were concerned, were through in an hour. Still he went on speaking. Hour after hour passed, and yet he continued to speak with constantly increasing eloquence, repeating and recapitulating without any seeming reason facts which he had already stated, and arguments which he had already urged. The truth was, as I gradually learned, that he was engaged in a hand-to-hand, or rather in a brain-to-brain, and a heart-to-heart contest with the foreman, whose resistance he was determined to break down, but who confronted him for 3 hours with defiance observable in every rigid line of his honest countenance. "You fool!" was the burden of the advocate's ingenious argument. "You rascal!" was the phrase legibly printed on the foreman's incredulous face, but at last the features of the foreman began to relax, and at the end the stern lines melted into acquiescence with the opinion of the advocate, who had been storming at the defenses of his mind, his heart, and his conscience for 5 hours, and had now entered as victor. The verdict was, "Not guilty." He who would do some great thing in this short life must apply himself to the work with such a concentration of his forces as to idle spectators who live only to amuse themselves looks like insanity. It is generally thought that when a man is said to be dissipated in his habits, he must be a drinking man, or a gambler, or licentious, or all three. But dissipation is of two kinds, coarse and refined. A man can dissipate or scatter all of his mental energies and physical power by indulging in too many respectable diversions, as easily as in habits of a viler nature. Property and its cares make some men dissipated. Too many friends make others. The exactions of society, the balls, parties, receptions, and various entertainments constantly being given and attended by the beau monde, constitutes a most wasting species of dissipation. Others, again, fritter away all their time and strength in political agitations or in controversies and gossip, others in idling with music or some other one of the fine arts, others in feasting or fasting, as their dispositions and feelings incline. But the man of concentration of purpose is never a dissipated man in any sense, good or bad. He has no time to devote to useless trifling of any kind, but puts in as many strokes of faithful work as possible toward the attainment of some definite good. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Franklin Canfield.
Chapter 11 of How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tech Savvy. How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 11. At Once. Note: the sublime precision that leads the earth over a circuit of 500 million miles back to the solstice at the appointed moment without the loss of 1 second. No, not the millionth part of a second, for ages and ages which it traveled that imperial road. By Edward Everett. Dispatch is the soul of business. By Chesterfield. Unfaithfulness in the keeping of an appointment is an act of clear dishonesty. You may as well borrow a person's money as his time. By Horace Mann. By the street of By and By one arrives at the house of Never. By Cervantes. The greatest thief this world has ever produced is procrastination, and he is still at large. By H. W. Shaw. "Oh, how I do appreciate a boy who is always on time," says H. C. Bourbon. "How quickly you learn to depend on him, and how soon you find yourself entrusting him with weightier matters. The boy who has acquired a reputation for punctuality has made the first contribution to the capital that in after years makes his success a certainty." "Nothing commends a young man so much to his employers," says John Stuart Blackie, "as accuracy and punctuality in the conduct of his business. And no wonder on each man's exactitude depends the comfortable and easy going of his machine. If the clock goes fitfully, nobody knows the time of day, and if your task is a link in the chain of another man's work, you are his clock, and